Sometimes, one short story can quiet the mind more than hours of thinking. Zen stories do just that, offering gentle truths through simple moments. In a busy world full of noise, these peaceful tales help us return to what really matters: silence, stillness, and inner ease. As you listen, let the stories soften your thoughts, slow your breath, and bring you back home to yourself. Let's get started. The cloud that forgot to drift. A gentle white cloud once floated high above a quiet mountain range. It had always moved peacefully with the wind, drifting from one horizon to another, watching rivers flow and forests grow below. But one day, the cloud stopped moving. It hovered in place, unsure why it had lost the will to drift. At first, the cloud believed it was broken. Something must be wrong with me, it thought. Why can't I go forward like before? The sky around it remained open and wide, but still the cloud stayed in one place, heavy with a feeling it couldn't name. Below, an old monk walked slowly up the mountain path. He looked up at the still cloud, smiled gently, and paused in his steps. "Even clouds need to rest," he whispered to the sky, though no one else was around to hear. "Even clouds must sometimes forget how to drift so they can remember how to be." The cloud listened in silence. It had never thought of stillness as something sacred. It only ever knew motion. Now it considered what it meant to be at rest, not because it failed, but because something deep inside it asked for stillness. As time passed, the cloud watched the world with new eyes. It saw how the trees swayed but remained rooted, how the wind moved but always returned, how the mountain never changed yet held so much life. The cloud began to see that being still didn't mean being lost. It meant listening more carefully to what couldn't be heard while moving. One evening, the wind gently brushed the edge of the cloud, as if asking, "Are you ready now?" The cloud waited. Then softly, without effort, it began to drift again, not because it had to, but because it chose to. It moved slowly, quietly, as if carrying something precious, the memory of stillness and the strength that silence gave it. Moral of the story: stillness is not failure. Sometimes we are meant to pause, not because we're lost, but because something within us is healing. Like the cloud, we may forget how to move, but in that stillness, we remember how to feel, how to listen, and how to begin again with gentleness. The next story is called A Bowl of Rice That Refused to Be Eaten. In a quiet monastery nestled beside a flowing river, meals were sacred. Every grain of rice was seen as a gift from the earth and the hands that prepared it. The monks ate in silence, giving thanks before each bite. Among them was a novice named Tammo, who struggled with hunger not just of the body, but of the heart. He longed for something more, though he didn't know what. One morning, after the morning bell rang, bowls were filled with simple, warm rice. Tammo received his with both hands, but paused. The rice looked ordinary. He stared at it, unimpressed, thinking, "This again? Every day the same plain rice. Why can't we have something more meaningful, something more beautiful?" He pushed the bowl aside. Hours passed. The rice grew cold. Still, Tammo refused to eat. He thought of rich food, exotic flavors, and the pleasures he left behind when joining the monastery. "This rice means nothing," he told himself. "It feeds my body, but not my spirit." An old monk sat beside him quietly, watching. He picked up Tammo's bowl, held it in his weathered hands, and said, "This rice once slept in the soil. It rose with the sun. It was touched by the hands of farmers and brought here through effort and love. To refuse this rice is to refuse life itself." The monk set the bowl down and walked away. Tammo stared at the untouched rice. He had never thought of it that way. Each grain was more than food, it was a miracle. It was earth turned into nourishment, silence turned into offering. Tears welled in his eyes, not because of shame, but because he finally saw the sacred in what he once dismissed. He took the bowl, now cool and sticky, and ate slowly. With each bite, he felt something deep soften inside him. It wasn't the rice that had refused to be eaten, it was his own closed heart. Moral of the story: when we seek grandness, we often miss the quiet beauty already in front of us. The simplest things can feed not only the body, but the soul if we're willing to see their worth. Gratitude begins when we stop asking for more and start honoring what is already in our hands. The next story is called The Bell That Rang Only in Silence. High in the mountains of a forgotten Zen temple, there was a bell unlike any other. Cast from rare metal and etched with ancient symbols, it was known not for the sound it made, but for the silence it required. No rope was tied to it, no monk was assigned to ring it, yet all who visited said they heard it. A young traveler named Keiji arrived at the temple, seeking clarity. His mind was loud with thoughts, fears, regrets, questions, plans. He had heard stories of the legendary bell that held deep wisdom in its ring. "I will climb the peak and hear it for myself," he said with determination. For days, Keiji sat in the cold hall, waiting for the bell to sound. He stared at it, willing it to move. He chanted louder than the others, meditated harder, and breathed deeper. But still no sound, no echo, only the quiet hum of wind moving through stone. Frustrated, he asked the abbot, "Why does the bell not ring for me?" The abbot smiled gently and said, "Because you are still louder than it is." Keiji did not understand. "But I have silenced my voice. I have stilled my breath." The abbot replied, "You have not yet silenced your wanting." That night, Keiji sat in the garden beneath a sky full of stars. He let the thoughts come, but no longer chased them. He felt the cold air without resisting it. He listened not to the bell, but to the rustle of the trees, the far-off stream, and the quiet ache in his heart. And in that moment, so soft, it could barely be felt, heard it. A clear, deep tone rang not through his ears, but through his chest. It wasn't sound, it was presence. The bell had spoken, but only when his mind had finally stopped shouting. Keiji bowed to the temple the next morning and left in silence. The bell had taught him what no words could. That silence isn't empty. It is full of everything we usually miss. Moral of the story: some truths can only be heard when all noise within us fades. Like the bell that rings only in silence, wisdom doesn't arrive with force, it appears gently when we become still enough to receive it. The quieter the mind, the louder the truth becomes. The next story is called Monk Who Spoke to Bamboo Once. In a village where the mist lingered until noon, a young monk named Sori was known for asking too many questions. He longed for enlightenment, but grew impatient with the stillness of temple life. "Why must I sit for hours?" he asked. "Why must answers hide behind silence?" One morning, the head monk, seeing Sori's restless eyes, simply pointed to the bamboo grove at the edge of the temple. "Go there," he said. "Do not return until you have heard the answer." Confused but obedient, Sori walked into the grove. The bamboo swayed softly, whispering in the breeze. He sat among them, folding his legs under him, and asked, "What am I missing? Why does silence feel so empty?" No reply came, only the creaking of bamboo stems brushing one another. He stayed the whole day, asking his questions aloud to the grove. "How do I awaken? What is the truth? Why does the Buddha not speak to me?" But the bamboo only danced. It made no promises. It offered no wisdom in words. As the sky darkened, something in Sori broke not from defeat, but from quiet surrender. He no longer asked. He simply watched. He noticed how the bamboo bowed with the wind, but never broke. How it stood tall, yet hollow inside. How it grew in clusters, never alone. A soft smile touched his lips. He whispered to one stalk, "You bend, but you do not fall." The bamboo didn't answer. It didn't need to. It simply moved again in the wind. And in that moment, Sori understood. The bamboo had spoken all along through movement, silence, and presence. When he returned to the temple the next morning, the head monk asked, "Well, did you hear?" Sori bowed deeply. "Yes," he said, "the bamboo said everything." Moral of the story: wisdom doesn't always speak with words. Sometimes it lives in how things move, how they bend, how they endure. Like bamboo, the truth is quiet but strong. When we stop demanding answers, we start receiving them in the way the world breathes, grows, and simply is. The next story is called The Rain That Waited for Permission. Long ago, in a valley often touched by drought, there lived an old farmer who prayed daily for rain. His fields were dry, his hands cracked from working the hard soil, and his heart grew tired from waiting. But still, each morning he lit incense and whispered, "Rain, you are welcome here." Not far from his fields, in a quiet monastery, a young monk named Kiko had begun questioning the idea of surrender. "Why must we wait for what we need?" he asked the elder monk. "Why not go and bring it ourselves?" The elder replied, "Some things are not taken, they arrive when the heart is ready to receive." That night, Kiko went for a walk and sat under a wide acacia tree overlooking the farmer's land. The sky was heavy with clouds, thick and dark, but the rain did not fall. The wind moved gently, as if asking permission to bring change. Kiko watched as the farmer came out and stood silently in his field. No anger, no pleading, just a deep bow to the sky. And then, softly, something shifted. A single drop landed, then another, and another. Within moments, the rain came soft at first, then steady, covering the earth with the gift it had held back for so long. Kiko's eyes filled with tears, though he didn't know why. Maybe it was the beauty. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of the farmer. Or maybe it was the rain itself, how it had waited, not out of cruelty, but out of deep respect. It had not come because it was asked. It had come because the ground, the man, and even the moment had become ready. The next morning, Kiko returned to the elder monk and simply said, "The rain taught me." The elder nodded, as if he had been waiting for that sentence for years. Moral of the story: not everything we long for arrives when we want it. Some things like healing, peace, or truth wait until we are quiet enough, open enough, and humble enough to receive them. The rain does not fall just because we call it. Sometimes it falls when we finally let go. The next story is called A Mirror with No Reflection. In a mountain temple wrapped in clouds, there was said to be a mirror unlike any other. It sat in a dark room lit only by a single candle, and those who looked into it saw nothing, no face, no body, just stillness. Many monks feared the mirror, believing it to be cursed or broken. "What kind of mirror shows no reflection?" they whispered. "What if it steals your image?" But the old abbot, who rarely spoke, would visit the mirror often, sometimes sitting before it for hours in silence. One day, a novice monk named Haru, curious and uncertain, approached the abbot and asked, "Why do you stare at a mirror that shows nothing?" The abbot looked up, calm and clear-eyed. "Because it shows me what I really am." Haru blinked. "But it shows no one." "Exactly," the abbot replied. Troubled, Haru decided to visit the mirror for himself. He entered the dark room, closed the door behind him, and knelt before it. As he stared into its surface, he saw only blackness, no face, no eyes, no trace of the boy he thought he was. At first, he panicked. Am I not real? Have I disappeared? But then a strange peace came over him. The longer he stared, the more he noticed something else's thoughts, his fears, his memories rising, and then dissolving. Without a reflection to hold on to, there was nothing left but the awareness of being. In that stillness, he saw something truer than his face. He saw how often he lived through roles and names, fears and hopes, never stopping to ask who was behind them all. The mirror had not erased him. It had simply removed the masks. He left the room without a word, tears gently lining his cheeks, not from sadness, but from the quiet relief of seeing himself for the first time. Moral of the story: sometimes we only find ourselves when we stop trying to see. The truest self is not the face in the glass, but the silence behind the eyes. When identity falls away, what remains is not emptiness but presence, deep and whole, like a mirror with no reflection. The next story is called The Sleep of a Lotus Seed. At the edge of a still pond, monks often gathered to meditate. Among them was an elderly gardener named Tetsu, who tended the temple grounds with gentle hands. He spoke little, but his presence was calming like morning mist or a warm breeze in spring. One afternoon, a young monk named Haru sat beside Tetsu and watched him plant lotus seeds in the muddy shallows of the pond. Haru tilted his head and asked, "Why plant what we cannot see bloom for a long time? The seed lies hidden in darkness. Isn't that wasted effort?" Tetsu smiled faintly and placed a seed gently into the muck. "The seed sleeps," he said, "but sleep is not death. Sleep is sacred." Days passed, and Haru watched the pond daily. The water rippled, dragonflies danced, but no lotus came. Impatient and uncertain, he returned to Tetsu. "Still nothing," he said. "Maybe the seed is broken." Tetsu didn't reply. He simply handed Haru a small wooden bowl filled with muddy water and asked him to sit. "Just watch," he said. Haru sat for hours, the bowl trembling slightly in his lap. The water looked dull and lifeless, yet in that stillness, something in him softened. His thoughts began to slow, his breath grew quiet. Suddenly he understood. The seed wasn't failing, it was becoming. In the silence beneath the surface, a transformation had already begun. Not loud, not visible, but real. Weeks later, without warning, a single green shoot rose from the water. By dawn the next day, a white lotus had opened its petals to the sky. Haru stood before it, silent and in awe not of the flower alone, but of the weight, the patience, and the mystery of what sleeps before it awakens. He bowed to the flower, but in truth, he was bowing to the silence beneath it. Moral of the story: growth does not always look like movement. Becoming takes time. Like the lotus seed resting in darkness, our own awakening often begins in stillness, where nothing seems to change. But within that sleep, something sacred is taking root. Trust the quiet, trust the unseen. The next story is called The Gate That Led Nowhere and Everywhere. At the edge of a forgotten forest stood an ancient wooden gate, worn smooth by wind and time. It had no walls, no fences, and nothing to guard. Travelers often passed it by, puzzled. Why build a gate in the middle of nothing, they asked. Some thought it was a relic, others believed it was broken, and most never gave it a second glance. But nearby, in a quiet hut, lived a solitary monk named Ama. She swept the ground around the gate each morning, tended a lantern by its side, and bowed gently to it as if greeting an old friend. When a curious traveler once asked, "Where does this gate lead?" Ima replied, "Wherever you are willing to go." One stormy evening, a young man named Ren arrived, weary and lost. He had wandered far, searching for peace, searching for something unnamed that burned inside his chest. He saw the gate and laughed bitterly. "Is this a joke? There's nothing here, no path, no temple, no promise." Ima nodded kindly. "Exactly." Frustrated, Ren shouted, "Then what's the point?" She walked over, lit the lantern again, and whispered, "The gate does not lead you forward or backward. It does not open to a place. It opens to a moment." Ren sat down, trembling with exhaustion. He looked through the empty frame of the gate and saw only darkness and trees. But slowly, as the wind quieted, he began to feel something shift. The smell of wet earth grew rich. The sound of leaves became music. His own breath, once tight, now softened. He realized the gate had never been a passage to somewhere else, it was a doorway to now. In stepping through, nothing outside him changed, but something within him did. He stood, bowed to the monk, and passed through the gate once more this time, not seeking, but simply walking. Moral of the story: some gates are not built to take you somewhere new. They exist to bring you back to presence, to breath, to stillness. When you stop needing to arrive, you discover you were already home. The path begins not ahead of you, but exactly where you stand. The next story is called The Ink That Evaporated Before Writing. In a quiet temple deep in the mountains, a well-respected calligrapher monk named Master Isho was known for painting teachings with just one brushstroke. His scrolls, though simple, carried such depth that people from far away would come just to sit before them. Each line, each curve, seemed to carry silence itself. A young disciple named Ray wished to follow in his footsteps. She practiced every day, her brush steady and strokes precise. But something was missing. Her work felt empty and her heart restless. One morning, she watched as Master Isho dipped his brush into the inkstone. But before he touched the scroll, he paused. He waited. Then he lifted the brush and found it dry. The ink had quietly evaporated. Surprised, Ray stepped forward and asked, "Master, the ink is gone. Shall I bring more?" But Isho only smiled. "Not yet," he said. "Let us sit with this first." They sat in silence, staring at the untouched paper and the dry brush between them. The room held no sound. No lesson was spoken. But the moment hung in the air, like a bell after it has rung. Minutes passed, maybe more. Ray began to feel something sternate in her hand, but in her chest. It wasn't frustration, it wasn't eagerness, it was stillness. She looked again at the blank page and saw something new. It was not empty, it was waiting, it was whole in its quietness. Master Isho finally spoke, his voice soft like wind through grass. Sometimes the ink disappears because the words are not yet true. Sometimes the page waits because the heart is still too loud. When we are ready, the ink will stay. That day, Ray did not write. She did not practice. She simply sat with the silence and let it shape her. And in that pause, she began to learn the part of art that lives before the brush moves. Moral of the story: creation is not just about action, it is about readiness. Some moments ask us to wait, not because we are failing, but because truth cannot be forced. Like ink that vanishes before writing, wisdom often arrives only after the noise within us fades. Be patient. The page will know when it's time. The next story is called The Sparrow That Whispered Koans. In a quiet corner of a Zen garden, where smooth stones rested beside raked sand, there lived a tiny brown sparrow. Unlike other birds, this sparrow never sang in chirps or calls. Instead, it made soft, clicking sounds that seemed to follow no rhythm, no melody, only mystery. Many monks ignored the bird, brushing it off as ordinary, just another part of the garden's background. But one monk, old and nearly blind, would sit near the sparrow every morning with a faint smile on his face. His name was Jotun, and he claimed the sparrow whispered koans. "You're just hearing things," the younger monk said. "That's not wisdom, it's just a bird." But Jotun would only reply, "Only those who stop listening expect truth to shout." One day, a novice named Anzu, weary of riddles and silence, decided to test Jotun's strange claim. He followed the old monk to the garden and sat beside him. "Let me hear what you hear," he said. They waited. The sparrow fluttered down to a stone nearby and tilted its head. Then came the clicking slow, then quick, then a pause. Nothing more. No answers, no words. Anzu grew frustrated. "That's it? That means nothing." Jotun turned to him gently. "Then, what do you expect meaning to sound like?" Anzu opened his mouth to argue, then fell silent. He looked at the bird again. It hopped to a ripple in the sand, pecked once, then flew away. That night, as Anzu lay in bed, something kept echoing in his mind, a question he couldn't form, a feeling without shape. In the quiet, he began to wonder not about the bird, but about himself. Over time, he returned to the garden daily. He didn't chase answers anymore. He just listened, not just to the sparrow, but to the wind, the gravel underfoot, the space between moments. Slowly, questions stopped needing answers. They became a way of seeing. Moral of the story: not all wisdom comes in words. Some truths arrive as feelings, as silence, as questions with no clear reply. Like the sparrow's whisper, the deepest lessons are not meant to be solved, but sat with, listened to, and carried like quiet lanterns inside the heart. The next story is called Lantern Lit Without Flame. There was once a village where people lit lanterns every evening as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The light was comforting, the ritual sacred. It reminded them that even as darkness came, they carried a glow within. At the edge of the village lived a monk named Anjo, quiet and kind, known for carrying a lantern that gave off no light. Each night, as the others lit their lamps with fire, Anjo would walk calmly with his dark lantern swinging gently at his side. Children laughed at it. Travelers frowned. "What use is a lantern that does not shine?" they asked. But Anjo never explained. He simply walked the same path, through shadows, beside the river, and into the stillness of the night. One evening, a young man named Daisuke followed him, curious and frustrated. "Why do you carry it?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Are you pretending to be wise, or is it just to be different?" Anjo stopped. He lifted the lantern, its paper walls soft and still. "This lantern is not for lighting my way," he said quietly. "It is to remind me that the path is always here even in darkness." Daisuke was confused. "But how do you see?" Anjo looked up at the sky. "The moon helps, sometimes. My breath helps. My footsteps help. But even when I can't see, I still walk. The flame I carry is not outside, it's in how I trust." They stood in silence. The night was cool. Crickets sang. Somewhere in the distance, a real lantern flickered out, swallowed by the wind, and yet nothing was lost. The path remained. Daisuke felt something soften in his chest. A fear he hadn't known he carried began to fade. He looked at Anjo's lantern again, and, for the first time, saw it differently. It wasn't broken. It was whole invisible light, resting inside. They walked back together. One lantern unlit, one heart now lit. Moral of the story: not all light comes from flame. Some light lives in trust, in quiet presence, in the courage to walk even when the way is unclear. When we stop looking for brightness outside us, we discover a glow that never fades. The next story is called The Brush That Painted Emptiness. Long ago, in a temple overlooking the sea, there lived an artist monk named Kaien. He was known for painting vast scrolls of mountains, rivers, and cloudshiz, brush strokes so gentle they seemed to breathe. But one day, Kaien stopped painting. When the other monks asked why, he simply said, "I have seen too much." He withdrew into silence, spending his days staring at blank paper, unmoving, unblinking. He would dip his brush into ink, lift it, then pause, and place it back down, never touching the paper. Whispers spread. He's lost his gift. Perhaps he's ill. But Kaien only smiled softly when asked. Years passed. One morning, a young monk named Ren, who had grown up watching Kaien, approached with quiet reverence. "Master," he asked, "why won't you paint?" Kain took a fresh sheet of paper, laid it before them both, and picked up his old brush. His hand hovered, steady and calm. Then finally, he made a single curved stroke. Nothing more. Just one mark, soft and fading at the end. Ren looked at the page and felt everything. Space, stillness, grief, beauty. Kain spoke for the first time in years. "This is the sea I once painted in waves. This is the mountain I once gave thousands of lines. Now I see they were always already here." Ren blinked, confused and moved. "But it's so empty." Kain nodded. "And yet it holds all things." That day, Kain left the temple for the final time, his brush resting by the paper. Some say that single stroke was his greatest work, though it hung in no hall and bore no name. Ren kept it safe, showing it only to those ready to see not the line itself, but the space it revealed. Moral of the story: true art is not always what is added, but what is left untouched. In stillness, we begin to see what words and strokes cannot express. Like the brush that painted emptiness, sometimes what seems like nothing holds the deepest presence. When we stop filling every space, meaning rises quietly from the silence. The next story is called "A Stone That Dreamed of Being Water." In a riverbed near a quiet temple, there was a single round stone. It had rested there for hundreds of years, shaped by time and flow. Though strong and silent, the stone often dreamed of something else, not to be still, but to move, to feel what it was like to drift like water, to dance with the current. Each morning, the stone watched the river rush by, carrying leaves and clouds reflected on its surface. "How free they are," the stone thought. "They go where they please, while I stay, unmoved, forgotten." The stone believed it had no purpose beyond sitting. And in its stillness, it began to ache, not physically, but deeply, from the longing to become something it could never be. One day, an old monk came to sit by the river. He placed his sandals beside the stone and dipped his hands into the water, cupping it gently. After a long pause, he looked down at the stone and said softly, "You hold the river, though you do not move with it." The stone listened, curious. "You see," the monk continued, "water may be free, but it borrows shape from everything it touches. It has no form of its own. But you shape the current. You give it rhythm. Without you, the river would forget where to go." The stone had never thought of itself that way. It had always seen stillness as a kind of failure, never realizing the quiet influence it carried. Seasons passed. The stone remained in place, but its heart no longer did. It felt the water differently, now not as a symbol of freedom, but as a partner, a conversation. Every drop that flowed over it became a gentle reminder that strength and softness can exist together. The stone no longer wished to be water. It only wished to be itself fully, deeply, and with quiet pride. Moral of the story: we often envy what we are not, forgetting the quiet power in what we are. Like the stone dreaming of being water, we may fail to see how our stillness shapes the world. You don't have to move to matter. Some of the most meaningful changes come from simply being where you are with presence, purpose, and peace. The next story is called "Tea Served by the Absent Host." In a remote village where clouds touched the roofs, there stood a small tea house known for its peace. Travelers spoke of it with quiet reverence, not because of the tea, though it was delicate and fragrant, but because of the way it was served. No one ever saw the host. Guests would enter the tea house and find a seat already prepared. A single cup, warm with freshly poured tea, would be waiting. The room was always still, no footsteps, no voices, only steam rising gently into the air. At first, people thought it was a trick. "Surely someone hides behind the screens," they said. But no matter how carefully they watched, no host ever appeared. One day, a proud scholar visited, hoping to solve the mystery. "Everything must be understood," he muttered, notebook in hand. He sat down, eyes sharp, ready to catch the host in the act. Moments later, the tea arrived, poured into his cup, still unseen. He sprang up, tore open every curtain, checked every door. Nothing, no one. Frustrated, he left without drinking. "It's an illusion," he scoffed. "An empty ritual." But behind him, another traveler entered, an old woman with tired eyes and a slow breath. She sat quietly, closed her eyes, and wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. She whispered, "Thank you," as if to someone real, and drank slowly, tearfully. Later, when asked why she had thanked someone she could not see, she smiled. "The tea was warm, the space was ready, the silence held me gently. That is enough. The host was present, just not in the way I expected." Years passed. The tea house remained unchanged. Still no host. Still warm tea. And still, those who truly needed peace found it there. They came not to be served, but to receive. Moral of the story: not all presence is seen. Some kindness arrives in quiet ways, without face, without name, without praise. Like tea served by the absent host, the deepest care asks for nothing in return. When we stop needing proof of love, we begin to feel it everywhere. The next story is called The Tree That Listened to Falling Leaves. On the edge of a forest path stood an old tree. Its roots were deep, its trunk thick with age, and its branches reached toward the sky like open arms. People passed it every day, monks, travelers, and children. Most never noticed it, but the tree noticed everything. Every autumn, the leaves would begin to fall. Some floated gently, others twirled wildly. A few clung on for days before letting go. And every time a leaf fell, the tree listened not with ears, but with presence. It felt the release, the quiet sigh, the small farewell each leaf carried as it left. One day, a young monk named Soma sat beneath the tree. His heart was heavy. He had recently lost someone he loved and could not understand why letting go hurt so much. As the wind blew, golden leaves rained down around him. He picked one up and whispered, "Why must everything leave?" The tree said nothing, but a single leaf, still half attached to a high branch, fluttered as if hesitating. It held on, trembling, until the wind grew strong enough to loosen it gently. It fell in silence and landed beside Soma. He stared at it, noticed how peaceful it looked. Not broken, not torn, just ready. And for the first time, he realized something. The tree never mourned the falling leaves. It honored them. It didn't grasp at them or wish them to stay. It simply opened its branches to the sky and let them go, one by one. That evening, Soma placed the leaf in his robe and bowed to the tree, his eyes full of quiet tears. Not from sadness, but from recognition. The tree did not speak, but it taught him this, that listening is not always about words, and letting go is not the same as loss. Moral of the story: letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means honoring what was, with love and grace. Like the tree that listens to each falling leaf, we can hold space for what is passing, not with fear, but with peace. Because everything that leaves us leaves something behind, a whisper, a lesson, a memory that stays rooted in the heart. The next story is called The Shadow That Bowed First. In a sunlit temple courtyard, where stone paths curved like rivers and blossoms fell in quiet rhythm, there lived a monk named Nari. She was calm in word and careful in thought, yet often troubled by a quiet pride that hid beneath her humility. She did everything right, offered incense, bowed deeply, spoke softly, and helped others with grace. But somewhere in her heart, she wanted to be seen for it. She wished her silence could be noticed. She wanted her humility to be praised. One afternoon, while sweeping fallen petals from the steps, Nari noticed something strange. Every time she bowed before the Buddha statue, a shadow on the wall bowed slightly before her. It moved just ahead of her own body, only by a breath, but unmistakably first. She paused, watching it. At first she thought it was a trick of the light, but the next day and the day after, the same thing happened. Her shadow bowed before she did. Troubled, she asked the elder monk, "Master, why does my shadow bow before me? What does it mean?" The master looked at her with kind eyes and said, "Perhaps it reminds you that your image arrives before your intention, that your presence is felt before your actions are seen, that even in silence, ego can cast a shape." Nari sat with this for days. She watched her shadow during chores, meditation, and prayer. She began to notice the small ways she hoped to be seen, even in kindness, even in service. One morning, as she bowed before the statue, she no longer looked at the wall. She closed her eyes and let go of being watched. She bowed not to be humble, but to disappear just for a moment into something greater than herself. And on the wall, the shadow bowed once more, ahead of her, and then dissolved gently in the morning light. Moral of the story: even our silence can carry pride. True humility asks for nothing, not even to be known as humble. Like the shadow that bowed first, ego sometimes arrives before we do. But when we let go of being seen, we begin to truly see. The next story is called The Mountain That Forgot Its Height. In a distant land, there stood a mountain so tall that its peak touched the clouds. For generations, people looked up to it with wonder, calling it sacred. Travelers came from far away to climb its steep trails, hoping to find clarity at its summit. The mountain had always known itself to be great, vast, unshakable, important. But over time, fewer visitors came. The forest below grew thick, covering the old paths. Clouds settled lower and stayed longer. Seasons blurred together. And slowly, the mountain forgot its own height. It no longer felt majestic. It began to wonder if it still mattered. "I don't rise above anything anymore," the mountain thought. "I'm hidden, quiet. No one sees me now." Deep within, something shifted. The mountain felt small, forgotten. Even the birds who once circled its cliffs had found new skies. One day, a wanderer arrived. She had no map, no goal, just a longing to walk. She didn't look up. She didn't search for the summit. She simply sat at the base, listening to the wind move through the trees. "I wonder," she said softly, "what it feels like to be a mountain, to hold the sky without needing to show it." The mountain heard her, and something inside it stirred. Not pride, not ego, just stillness. And in that stillness it remembered, it had never needed to be seen to be whole. It had never needed to rise above to be strong. Even in fog, it was still the mountain. Even when forgotten, it still held rivers, roots, and silence. The mountain did not speak. It didn't need to. Its presence said everything. The wanderer stood, touched the earth gently, and whispered, "Thank you." And with that, she left, never reaching the peak, but carrying something higher in her heart. Moral of the story: you do not have to be seen to have worth. You do not need to rise above others to be whole. Like the mountain that forgot its height, your value is not in being noticed, but in simply being. Strength lives quietly in presence, in patience, in being steady even when no one is watching. The next story is called A Cloak Made of Forgotten Thoughts. There was once a monk named Tenzin who lived far from cities, in a valley where fog drifted low and silence settled like snow. He had once been a scholar known for his sharp mind, clever words, and endless memory. But as the years passed, something shifted in him. He began to forget, not just names or dates, but entire teachings, scriptures, and answers he had once recited effortlessly. At first, he tried to hold on to them. He reread his old scrolls, repeated chants, and scolded his own mind. But the more he tried, the more the words slipped through, like water in cupped hands. One day, he gave up. He folded his robes, closed his books, and walked deep into the forest. "If my mind no longer holds what it once did," he whispered, "then perhaps it is time to listen instead of remember." He built a hut beside a stream and lived simply, without books or teachings. Days passed, then months, then years. People began to hear of a strange monk in the forest, quiet, kind, and somehow weightless. Not because he was simple, but because being near him felt like standing in soft wind, nothing to grasp, nothing to resist, just peace. A student eventually came to him and asked, "What do you know now, after forgetting so much?" Tenzin smiled and replied, "I know how to walk without noise. I know how to watch the rain without naming it. I know how to sit without asking why. And I know that thoughts, when forgotten, become sky." The student was confused. "But isn't memory sacred? Doesn't knowledge matter?" Tenzin lifted his sleeve and said, "This cloak I wear is made of forgotten thoughts. Every time I let go of something I once clung to, it became part of me in a quieter way, not in the mind, but in presence." That night, the student could not sleep. He listened to the rustle of leaves and thought not of lessons, but of stillness and, for the first time, felt deeply held by it. Moral of the story: not all forgetting is loss. When we release what once defined us, we make space for something softer to take its place. Like a cloak made of forgotten thoughts, wisdom can live beyond memory in breath, in stillness, and in how we simply are. The next story is called "The Sound of a Book Closing Itself." In a dim corner of the monastery's library sat an old book, its pages yellowed, its cover worn soft from hands long gone. No one had touched it in years. The monks passed by daily, choosing newer scrolls, fresh teachings, stories with sharper ink and clearer words. The old book waited, its spine silent but steady. One afternoon, a young monk named Lian wandered into the library, tired not from work but from thought. His mind was crowded, filled with doubts, questions, and words that felt heavy. He reached for a text on enlightenment, but something stopped him. He turned and noticed the old book resting on the shelf, slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting. Curious, Lian opened it. The pages didn't offer clear answers. Instead, they held stories without endings, poems that trailed off mid-thought, teachings written more in space than in ink. He read slowly, confused but drawn in. The silence between the lines felt louder than the words themselves. As dusk approached, a breeze slipped through the open window. It was soft, almost hesitant. The old book responded not by turning a page, but by closing itself. Slowly, gently, with a sound so small it might have been a breath. Lian froze. He looked at the book, then at his own hands. And for the first time, he understood something without needing to explain it. He had read enough. He didn't need more teachings, more pages, more noise. The book had closed not to shut him out, but to remind him that wisdom doesn't always come from finishing things. Sometimes it comes from stopping, from allowing stillness to say what words cannot. Lian bowed to the book, placed it back on the shelf, and left the library without taking anything. But something had been given. That night, as he sat in meditation, his mind grew quiet, not because he understood everything, but because he no longer needed to. Moral of the story: sometimes the most powerful lesson is knowing when to stop searching. Like the sound of a book closing itself, silence can hold truth more deeply than endless words. In letting go of more, we often find exactly what we needed all along. The next story is called "A Path That Doubled Back in Time." In the hills of a quiet province, where moss grew thick and the trees seemed older than memory, there was a stone path known by few and walked by even fewer. It led through a dense forest and seemed ordinary at first, until one began to notice something strange. The further you walked, the more familiar everything became. The same fallen branch, the same bend in the trail, the same patch of sunlight through the leaves. And yet, no one had turned around. One monk, named Yuki, heard whispers of this path and went to find it, driven by a question that had followed her since childhood. Can we ever truly move forward, or are we always walking circles through ourselves? She stepped onto the path before sunrise, her sandals brushing against the dew. The forest greeted her with silence. As she walked, she noticed memories rising, childhood laughter, an old grief, a face she once loved. She didn't summon them. They came on their own, like echoes from trees that had once heard her thoughts. Hours passed, the trail wound deeper, but instead of leading outward, it felt like it was folding in. Her body moved forward, but her heart moved backward into places she thought were long healed. Suddenly, she found herself at the beginning again. The same rock, the same bird call, the same moment. But she had not turned around. She sat down, breathless, not from fear but from recognition. The path wasn't broken, she realized. It was showing her something. Time wasn't a line. It was a spiral. What she thought she had left behind was still within her, and what she would find tomorrow had already been planted in yesterday. She rose slowly, not to escape the circle, but to walk it with awareness, not to get somewhere new, but to meet herself again with kinder eyes. Moral of the story: progress is not always forward. Sometimes the path brings us back, not to trap us, but to teach us. Like a trail that doubles back in time, life leads us through old places so we can see them with new hearts. What repeats may not be failure, but an invitation to truly arrive. The next story is called The Silence After a Flute Cracks. In a village surrounded by hills, there lived a flute maker named Junsei, known for crafting instruments that could make the wind itself pause to listen. His flutes were not perfect in appearance, but their sound carried warmth, like a memory you didn't know you missed. Junsei had one flute he never sold. It was his first. Carved from a crooked piece of bamboo, its tone was soft and breath-like, almost like it whispered instead of played. Each evening, after the village fell quiet, Junsei would sit alone and play it just a few notes. Then silence. One winter night, as the snow began to fall, Junsei brought the flute to his lips, but the bamboo cracked. It split down the middle with a sharp sound, then silence. He sat still, the broken flute in his lap. He didn't move, he didn't cry. He simply listened to the space the music used to fill. The next morning, a young boy who often listened from outside approached Junsei. "Will you make another flute?" he asked softly. Junsei shook his head. "No," he said. "This one has finished its song." "But don't you miss the sound?" the boy asked. "I do," Junsei replied. "But now I hear something else." The boy was confused. "Hear what?" Junsei looked out at the snow falling over the rooftops and said, "The silence after the flute cracked. It's not empty. It's full of what the flute gave me." In the days that followed, Junsei no longer played, but he still sat at the same spot each evening, breathing deeply, his hands resting on his knees. And though no music was heard, something beautiful lingered in the air. The villagers began to sit outside in the snow, not to hear the flute but to share in the silence it left behind. Somehow, that quiet was even more moving than the notes had been. Moral of the story: not all endings are losses. Sometimes, when something precious breaks, it leaves behind a silence that teaches more than sound ever could. The flute may stop singing, but the stillness afterward holds its echo soft, deep, and full of meaning. what remains is not absence but presence of a different kind. The next story is called The Dream That Dreamed the Monk. In a mist-veiled monastery nestled beside a sleeping lake, there lived an old monk named Riku, who often wandered between sleep and waking as if they were the same. His speech was quiet, his steps softer than breath, and his eyes held the stillness of someone who had seen beyond questions. One morning, after a long meditation, Riku told the gathered monks something unusual. "Last night," he said, "I dreamed I was a cloud drifting over a great mountain. I felt no weight, no thought, only the wind moving through me. I rained gently over valleys, disappeared in sunlight, and knew no name." The youngest monk chuckled. "And then you woke up?" But Riku only smiled. "Perhaps. Or perhaps the cloud is dreaming me now." A silence followed. Some laughed nervously, others frowned, but one monk, a young woman named Hana, sat frozen. That question burrowed into her like a quiet bell. What if I am not the dreamer? What if I am the dream? She could not let it go. That night, and many after, she stared at the stars and wondered, who is breathing when I sleep? Who watches when I blink? Is this life something I live, or something being lived through me? Time passed. She ate, prayed, swept the temple floors, but everything shimmered slightly, as if the world had loosened its edges. One evening, while meditating beside Riku, she whispered, "How do I know if I'm awake?" He opened his eyes and said, "You don't. And that is your freedom." Her breath caught, not in fear, but in awe. The line between dream and waking had blurred, not to confuse her, but to show her something more. She stopped trying to name things so tightly. She let each moment be what it was, a breath, a blink, a passing wind. Whether dreamed or dreamer, it no longer mattered. Moral of the story: what we call reality may only be one layer of seeing. Like the dream that dreamed the monk, truth does not always arrive as certainty but as wonder. When we stop needing to know what is real, we begin to live with open hands and wakeful hearts. The next story is called Moonlight, Boiling Over in a Cup. In a temple high above the river valley, tea was more than a drink, it was a ceremony of presence. Each evening, as the moon rose, a monk named Riku would boil water in a blackened kettle, pour it slowly into simple clay cups, and serve it to the others with great care. Riku was young, but his touch was steady. He believed in doing everything with intention. One night, while preparing tea alone under the open sky, he looked into the kettle just as the moon's reflection shimmered on the surface. The wind was still, the fire hissed gently, and there, in the rising steam, the moon seemed to dissolve. He poured the hot water into his own cup, and for a brief moment it looked as if the moon itself had followed, glowing softly inside the tea, resting in the ripples. He stared at it, breathless. But then the cup shook slightly in his hands. A drop spilled over the edge, then another, and soon the moon was gone, its reflection lost in the overflow. The moment passed, leaving only warm tea and a quiet heart. Riku sat down, holding the cup gently. He did not drink right away. He simply held it, thinking, how easily beauty arrives, and how easily we lose it by holding too tightly. Later, he spoke to the elder monk about what he saw. "The moon was there," he said, "in my cup, but I tried to keep it, and it spilled." The elder smiled and replied, "You did not lose the moon, you only lost its reflection. The moon is still above you. It cannot be held, only witnessed." Riku looked up and saw it again, full, glowing, silent. That night, he learned to drink tea without reaching for more than the cup offered. He did not try to capture the moment. He let it pass through him like warmth, like steam, like moonlight on water. Moral of the story: some moments are too beautiful to keep. Like moonlight boiling over in a cup, they cannot be possessedly experienced. When we stop trying to hold them, we begin to understand their true gift, not in staying, but in passing through us with quiet grace. The next story is called The Fisherman Who Cast Nets in the Sky. By a quiet bay where fog met the sea like breath on a mirror, lived an old fisherman named Mori. Every morning, while others prepared boats and bait, Mori walked to the highest cliff and cast his net not into water, but into the sky. Villagers watched him with curiosity, then laughter, then pity. "What does he expect to catch?" they whispered. "There are no fish in the clouds." Children mocked him. Travelers shook their heads. But Mori never responded. He would throw the net wide into the wind, wait in stillness, then gently pull it back empty, always empty. One day, a wandering monk named Shiko visited the village. Seeing the fisherman standing on the cliff, net in hand, the monk joined the crowd below. He asked, "How long has he done this?" "Years," they replied. "He's mad." But Shiko said nothing. That evening, he climbed the cliff himself and sat beside Mori. "What are you fishing for in the sky?" he asked gently. Mori smiled without turning. "The same thing you seek in silence." Shiko blinked. "And what is that?" "Stillness, space, a glimpse of something that cannot be held." The monk understood. In his own way, he too had cast nets into emptiness, sitting in meditation, breathing through questions that had no answers. As the sky turned golden with sunset, Mori pulled in his empty net once more and looked at it with deep reverence. "It's never empty," he said. "It just doesn't hold what eyes expect to see." Word of this conversation spread, and slowly, villagers grew quiet when they saw Mori at dawn. No longer mocking, no longer trying to understand, just watching the gentle sweep of his net across the open sky. Some even said the clouds moved differently around him. Moral of the story: not all nets are meant to catch. Some are cast to remember the vastness above and within. Like the fisherman who cast nets in the sky, we sometimes reach into silence, not to grasp, but to let go. What we bring back may look like nothing but feel like peace. The next story is called The Teacup That Wrote Poetry in Steam. In a small mountain monastery where clouds often drifted through the hallways, a potter monk named Shin devoted his life to making teacups. Not ornate ones, but plain and humble, soft curves, uneven rims, clay that still smelled faintly of rain. His cups were known not for how they looked, but for what they held. One chilly morning, after the sunrise bell, Shin poured hot water into one of his favorite cups. As the steam rose, he noticed delicate shapes forming spirals, waves, curves that vanished as quickly as they came. But just before they disappeared, they reminded him of brush strokes, like characters from a forgotten poem. He leaned closer. A breath of warmth touched his cheek, and in that brief moment, he felt something stir in not thought, not memory, but feeling. The steam didn't say anything out loud, but it left behind a silence full of meaning. That day, he didn't speak to anyone. He simply made more cups, each one a little lighter, a little thinner at the edge. He didn't try to capture the poetry of the steam, only created space for it to rise. A young monk named Rika approached him and asked, "Why do your teacups always seem to say something, even when they're empty?" Shin smiled and replied, "Because I leave room for silence. The steam finishes what I begin." "But it disappears so fast," Rika said. "So do we," said Shin. "And yet, while we're here, we still leave something behind." That evening, Rika poured her own cup of tea and watched as the steam curled into the air. She didn't try to understand it. She didn't try to name it. She just let it rise and vanish, feeling its warmth linger even after it was gone. And for the first time, she felt like the steam had written something just for her, a poem only her heart could read. Moral of the story: some beauty can't be held or written down. It appears for a moment, touches something deep, and disappears, leaving a feeling that lasts longer than any words. Like steam rising from a teacup, true poetry lives in the spaces we don't try to control. Let it come, let it go, and let it change you. The next story is called The Drum That Beat Without Hands. In a mountain temple where clouds rested like blankets on stone, there was a great drum housed in a small wooden hall. No monk had touched it in decades. No mallets lay nearby. And yet, it was said the drum would sound during deep silence, without rhythm, without warning, without hands. It was called the heart drum. Pilgrims traveled long distances hoping to hear it. Some sat for hours, chanting and meditating. Some struck nearby walls, hoping to awaken its voice. But the drum remained still, mute as stone. Many left disappointed. One restless monk named Sora became obsessed with it. I will be the one to hear it, he vowed. He meditated longer, breathed deeper, sat more still than ever before. But his desire burned hot in his chest, always pushing, always needing. Days passed, then weeks, but no sound came. Frustrated, he approached the abbot. Why does the drum not speak? I've done everything. The abbot looked at him kindly. Have you truly done nothing? Sora was confused. I've been still. I've waited in silence. The abbot replied, Yes, but your silence was shouting. That night, Sora gave up. He no longer sat before the drum with hope. He wandered the temple grounds, tired and unsure. He watched wind move through trees. He watched shadows stretch over the walls. He returned to the drum one last timino to hear it, but to rest. He sat down, no longer searching, and let himself dissolve into the quiet. No goal, no effort, just breath and being. And in that stillness a sound rose. Soft, deep, like thunder whispered through wood. A single beat, then silence again. His eyes filled with tears, not because the drum had finally spoken, but because he had finally stopped asking it to. Moral of the story: some truths can't be summoned by force. Like the drum that beat without hands, certain awakenings only happen when the noise within us falls completely still. When we stop trying to listen, we begin to hear. When we stop trying to arrive, we discover we're already there. The next story is called The Pebble That Floated Briefly. Beside a still pond where monks often came to sit and reflect, there lay a small, round pebble. It was plain, no shine, no special color, not even smooth. But this pebble had one wish: to float. Each day, it watched leaves drift gently on the water. It saw feathers land and dance across the surface before moving on with the breeze. Even the reflections of clouds seemed to glide effortlessly. But when the pebble tried, it always sank. I am too heavy, it thought. I do not belong on the surface. One afternoon, during a heavy storm, the pond overflowed. Water rushed in fast, carrying sticks, petals, and even small stones. For a moment, the current lifted the pebble off the ground. It rose not high, not far, but enough. For a few seconds, it floated. It felt the sky above and the weightlessness it had always dreamed of. But just as quickly, the water calmed and the pebble sank again, returning to the pond floor with a soft thud. It did not cry. It did not feel sorrow. Instead, it felt full. Not because it had stayed on the surface, but because it had touched it just once. A monk named Yuna, sitting nearby, had seen it happen. She smiled to herself and whispered, "Even the earth can be light for a moment." That evening, Yuna shared the story during tea. "Some of us are like feathers," she said. "Some of us, stones. But every heart longs to rise. And sometimes, life lifts us just briefly to remind us that we can." The other monks were silent, not because they had nothing to say, but because they understood. The pebble remained in the pond, quiet and resting. It no longer watched the leaves with envy. It had touched the surface. It knew what it meant to rise. Moral of the story: Even if you carry weight, even if you feel meant to sink, moments of lightness still find you. Like the pebble that floated briefly, you may rise just once, but in that rise is a lifetime of meaning. You don't need to float forever. You only need to know it was possible. The next story is called The Bell Without a Temple. Deep in the forest, where moss-blanketed old stones and sunbeams danced like breath through trees, there stood a bell tall, weathered, and beautiful. But there was no temple around it, no monks, no altar. Just the bell, standing alone beneath the open sky. Travelers would come across it unexpectedly. Some rang it out of curiosity, others out of reverence. Its sound was unlike anything they had heard, low, soft, and somehow familiar, as if echoing not through the air, but through the heart. Many wondered, who placed it here? Why no temple? No one knew. But the bell remained. One day, a young monk named Aya, wandering alone through a season of doubt, stumbled upon the bell. She was tired, not in body but in spirit. She had studied scriptures, recited chants, and sat through hours of meditation, yet her heart still felt heavy, like she was searching for something always just out of reach. She saw the bell and stopped. There was no ceremony, no guidance, no reason to bow. Just the bell, just the silence. She placed her palm gently against its side and whispered, "Why are you here, without a temple?" A breeze passed through the forest, stirring the leaves. She stood for a long time, listening not to answers, but to the absence of them. Then she lifted her hand and rang the bell. Its sound moved through the trees like memory, not loud, not proud, just real. And for a moment, Aya felt all the teachings she'd carried drop away. All the effort, all the forms, all the trying. She began to cry, not from sadness, but from the relief of meeting something that asked nothing of her. She sat beside the bell until evening. She didn't meditate, she didn't chant, she just breathed, and for the first time in many months, it was enough. Moral of the story: not all sacred things need walls around them. Like the bell without a temple, some truths stand quietly on their own, waiting to be found by those who no longer need structure to feel the sacred. When we stop seeking the perfect place, we begin to hear the sound that has always been calling us home. The next story is called Wind That Remembered a Name. High in the hills beyond the monastery walls, the wind moved freely, rushing through pine branches, brushing across water, lifting prayer flags into the open sky. It touched everything, but stayed nowhere. It had no form, no color, no name, just motion, just presence. But long ago, a young child once whispered a name into the wind. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. She stood on a quiet hill, alone, missing someone who had passed. She didn't know where to send her love, so she gave it to the wind. She said the name just once, Aiko, then closed her eyes and let the sound go. Years passed. The girl grew older, the seasons turned. The wind kept moving, unnoticed by most. Yet deep within it, that name stayed. Not as a word, but as a feeling, a thread of warmth, tucked inside gusts and hushes. The wind, though nameless itself, had remembered. One day at the monastery, an elderly monk named Masaru sat meditating under a tall tree. The wind blew gently through the leaves, but then suddenly shifted. He opened his eyes. A strange stillness followed, a feeling not of cold, but of deep recognition. He couldn't explain why, but a single name came to his lips. Aiko. He had never spoken that name before, and yet, saying it filled him with a sorrow and sweetness that felt ancient. A name not his but known to him all the same. He bowed his head and whispered, "Whoever you are, may you be at peace." The wind wrapped around him once more, like a soft hand, then moved on. And far away, in a city by the sea, A woman no longer young felt a sudden warmth in her chest. She had not heard the name spoken in years, but she smiled unknowingly and whispered, "Thank you." Moral of the story: not all things are forgotten. Even what we offer in silence, love, names, prayers can travel farther than we know. Like wind that remembers a name, the world holds what we release with sincerity. No word spoken from the heart is ever truly lost. The next story is called Lantern Carried by a Fox's Memory. In the deep folds of a misted forest, where the trees whispered ancient names and the air smelled of moss and thyme, there lived a fox, old, clever, and rarely seen. Many believed she was no ordinary creature. Some said she was once a temple guardian. Others said she remembered things no one else could. At twilight, villagers swore they saw her walking along forgotten forest paths, with a small lantern dangling from her mouths. Its flame dim but steady, glowing softly against the dusk. No one knew where she was going, and no one dared to follow. One night, a monk named Haruto, grieving a recent loss and burdened by memories he could no longer carry, wandered into the forest. His steps were slow, unsure. He no longer sought peacefully escape. As the trees thickened and his path blurred, he saw a flicker of light. There, just ahead, moved the fox, her lantern swaying like a heartbeat. He followed, drawn not by curiosity, but by something deeper. The fox did not run. She walked slowly, deliberately, leading him through narrow trails, across streams, beneath hanging vines. With each step, Haruto felt old thoughts rise, moments of joy, regret, love, and lost memories that had grown heavy. But in the soft glow of the lantern, these memories began to feel different, not sharper, not brighter, just lighter. The fox finally stopped at a small clearing where moonlight spilled like water. She set the lantern down and looked at him, not with eyes, but with presence. Then she turned and vanished into the dark, as quietly as she had come. Haruto stood alone, the lantern now at his feet. He knelt and cupped it in his hands. Its light warmed him not with fire, but with a kind of remembering that no longer hurt. He returned to the monastery at dawn, carrying no answers, only the silence of that night and a peace that felt like something remembered, not learned. Moral of the story: some memories do not ask to be solved, only softened. Like a lantern carried by a fox's memory, wisdom sometimes comes in quiet forms, guiding us not to new truths, but back to old ones we had forgotten how to hold gently. The next story is called The Monk Who Prayed with His Back. In a quiet Zen temple nestled beneath the mountains, there lived a monk named Jiro. He was known not for his chanting nor for his sermons, but for something that puzzled many. He always sat facing away from the altar when he prayed. The younger monks found it strange. How can his prayers reach the Buddha if he turns his back to the sacred image? One whispered. "Doesn't that show disrespect?" said another. But Jiro never responded to the whispers. Every morning, before the first bell, he would quietly enter the temple, kneel with his back to the statue, and pray with his hands resting gently in his lap, eyes lowered, breath steady. Then he would leave without a word. One day, a curious student finally asked the head monk, "Why is Jiro allowed to pray that way? Isn't he doing it wrong?" The head monk looked at the questioner with kind eyes and said, "Jiro does not face the altar because he believes the Buddha is not only in front of him but behind him, beside him, within him, and within you." The student frowned. "But how do we know if his prayers are real?" The head monk replied, "Because he prays not to be seen, not even by the Buddha." That evening, the student quietly followed Jiro and sat in the back of the temple. He watched as the old monk bowed not deeply, but sincerely, and took his seat facing the entrance. Not the statue, not the candle, just the open doorway where light and footsteps came and went. For the first time, the student noticed something he hadn't before. When Jiro sat that way, he wasn't turning his back on the sacred. He was turning his heart toward the world, toward everyone who hadn't yet entered the temple, toward the pain that had not yet found peace. And in that moment, he understood. Some prayers are not spoken to be heard. They are offered quietly, in directions where no one expects them, like light cast behind a flame. Moral of the story: true devotion doesn't always follow tradition. Sometimes the deepest prayers are made not in front of statues, but in the direction of the forgotten. Like the monk who prayed with his back, those who serve the unseen often carry the quietest, most powerful faith. The next story is called The Book That Closed at Birth. In a hidden library beneath the oldest Zen temple, past shelves of scrolls and ink-worn wisdom, sat a single book untouched, unmarked, and bound in deep indigo silk. Its spine was smooth. Its cover bore no title. But most curious of all, the book was sealed shut. Generations of monks had wondered about it. Perhaps it holds the Buddha's final words, one whispered. Or secrets too sacred to be read, said another. Many tried to open it, gently or with force, but its pages would not yield. The abbot always shook his head with a small smile. That book closed itself the day it was born, he said, not to hide truth, but to protect it. Years later, a young monk named Kana came to the temple seeking answers. Her life had been marked by longing for meaning, for purpose, for something that could explain the ache she often felt in quiet moments. When she found the sealed book, she felt drawn to it. Day after day, she sat near it in the library, not touching, just being. One evening, she asked the abbot, "Why would a book exist if no one can read it?" The abbot looked at her gently and said, "Must all books be opened to be understood?" Kana stayed up that night, sitting beside the book in silence. She thought of her own life, filled with stories she had never shared, dreams she'd forgotten, wounds she carried but never named. She realized that she too was a kind of book closed in places, unreadable even to herself. And yet, she was not broken. She was whole, even in mystery. As dawn approached, Kana bowed before the sealed book and whispered, "Thank you." The book remained silent, still unopened, still complete. She walked away not with pages of answers, but with something deeper. The understanding that not all truths must be spoken, not all stories told, and not all wounds open to heal. Moral of the story: some truths live in silence, not to hide, but to rest. Like the book that closed at birth, we each carry parts of ourselves that remain sealed not out of fear, but out of sacredness. Wholeness does not always mean being understood. Sometimes it means being honored exactly as we are. The next story is called The Footprint in the Sky. Long ago, high above a forest temple, a monk named Nao often lay on the rooftop at night, gazing at the stars. While others studied sutras or swept the garden, Nao would watch the sky and wonder about things that had no answers. One evening, after days of silence, he whispered, "If the sky holds no ground, why do I still feel I'm standing on something?" That night, he dreamed of walking through the clouds. In his dream, each step left a faint mark like a footprint pressed into air. He turned to look behind him, and there, floating where nothing should hold form, were soft impressions, glowing gently in the moonlight. When he awoke, the dream stayed with him. He asked the head monk, "Can we leave footprints where there is no path?" The head monk smiled. "Only when the walking is honest." From that day on, Nao changed. He didn't talk more or teach more, but the way he moved became softer, more deliberate. When he poured tea, it was with quiet care. When he bowed, it was as though the ground itself was sacred. When he passed through a room, people felt lighter, though they didn't know why. Years later, A young monk who never knew now found an old robe tucked in a cedar chest. It smelled of night air and carried a single thread of silver stitched near the hem like a path leading nowhere. He asked, "Whose was this?" The elder monks only smiled. "A man who walked in the sky," one said. And though the young monk didn't understand, that night he looked up and whispered, "Where are you now?" In that moment, a breeze stirred, a star flickered, and something in his chest felt quietly held. Moral of the story: not all footsteps are left on earth. Some are made in hearts, in moments, in the sky of someone's memory. Like the footprint in the sky, true presence leaves no weight, but it stays long after the form is gone. When you move with love and stillness, your path may vanish behind you, but it echoes forever. The next story is called "The Moment the Candle Forgot Heat." In a quiet meditation hall carved from stone, monks gathered each evening to sit in silence. At the center of the room stood a single candle tall, steady, and golden. Its flame had been passed down for generations, always lit at dusk, always extinguished at dawn. It was said that this candle remembered everything, each breath, each prayer, each sorrow that passed through the room. One winter night, as snow fell softly outside, a young monk named Mika sat closest to the flame. Her thoughts were heavy, haunted by anger she couldn't let go of, by a shame that clung to her like smoke. She had tried to breathe it away, to bow it away, to sit through it, but it stayed. She stared at the candle, watching its gentle flicker. The warmth should have comforted her, but instead she felt cold inside, untouched by its glow. And then something strange happened. For the briefest moment, the candle's flame continued to shine, but she felt no heat. The room stayed still. The light remained, but it no longer warmed her. It was as if the candle had forgotten how to burn. Startled, Mika blinked and reached her hands closer. Nothing, no warmth, only light. She looked around, but no one else noticed. The monk sat calmly, breathing in rhythm. She whispered in her heart, "Have I grown numb, or has the flame left me?" Just then, an older monk beside her leaned in and murmured, "When the heart closes, even fire cannot enter." Tears welled in Mika's eyes, not from pain, but from recognition. Her mind had been so full of trying, resisting, controlling, that it had left no room for warmth. The flame had not forgotten heat, she had forgotten how to receive it. She softened her breath, released the tightness in her chest, and slowly the warmth returned, not just from the candle, but from within. Moral of the story: even light cannot warm a heart that is closed. Like the moment the candle forgot heat, we sometimes believe the world has gone cold, when it is our own inner flame that needs tending. Openness is not weakness, it is the doorway through which warmth returns. The next story is called "A Raindrop That Sat for Years." High on a windswept cliff where few ever climbed, there was a smooth, hollowed stone. In its center, untouched by sun or bird or leaf, sat a single raindrop. It had fallen many seasons ago during a storm that had come and gone quickly, and it never dried, never moved. It simply stayed. No wind reached it, no heat disturbed it. Time passed, and still the raindrop remained. In the valley below, monks and villagers spoke of the eternal drop, though few believed it existed. One monk, named Cain, decided to see it for himself, not out of pride, but because something in his heart was restless. He was always chasing clarity, always seeking the next answer. So he climbed. The journey was long, steep, and silent. When Cain finally reached the top, he stood before the hollowed stone and saw it, the raindrop, still and clear, reflecting the sky in its tiny curve. He bowed not out of ritual, but from instinct. He sat beside it for hours, watching, waiting, but nothing happened. The drop did not shimmer, it did not vanish. It simply existed without rush, without story. Cain began to weep, not from sadness, but because for the first time he saw what it meant to just be. The raindrop had not tried to last. It had not resisted the world. It had simply landed and stayed. Not out of strength, but because the conditions were right, and it had accepted them. Cain whispered, "I have been running to find what you learned by staying." He descended quietly, never speaking of what he saw. But after that day, he no longer hurried through his tasks. He no longer needed answers to every question. He moved like the drop present, unafraid of stillness. And sometimes, at sunset, the other monks would see him sitting for hours, eyes open, hands relaxed, reflecting the world without clinging to it. Moral of the story: stillness is not stagnation. Like a raindrop that sits for years, sometimes presence means staying exactly where life has placed you, without struggle, without chasing, without fear. In doing nothing, we may begin to reflect everything. The next story is called The Bamboo Grove That Learned Silence. Beyond a small village, nestled between two hills, stretched a long bamboo grove, tall, slender, and always moving. The wind played through it like a flute, rustling leaves and creaking stems in songs older than memory. People passing through would often stop just to listen. But one year, the winds grew loud and wild. Storm after storm swept the grove. The bamboo no longer danced, it groaned, cracked, and cried out like a forest in pain. Travelers hurried by. Monks stopped coming. The once peaceful grove became a place of unrest. When the winds finally quieted, the grove remained noisy. The bamboo seemed to carry the storms inside them. Every breeze, even the softest one, brought a restless clatter, like memories that wouldn't settle. The elders in the nearby temple noticed this change. They sent a monk named Arayung, gentle, and often overlooked, to live in the grove and listen, not to fix, not to teach, just to listen. Arai built a small hut and sat beneath the bamboo each day. He didn't speak, he didn't chant, he simply breathed with the grove, listened to the noise without judging it, listened to the pain without needing to name it. At first, the bamboo screamed, the wind returned, and again they cried out. But Arai stayed still, and over time, something shifted. The rustling grew softer, the creaks less sharp. The grove began to remember what it once was, not by forgetting the storms, but by not clinging to them. One morning, after many months, Arai awoke to a silence so pure it seemed to hum. The wind moved through the bamboo again, but this time it didn't stir noise, it stirred presence. The grove no longer resisted, it breathed, and in that breath it had learned silence. Moral of the story: even what once held noise can learn quiet. Like the bamboo grove that learned silence, we too carry storms inside us, but they do not define us. With stillness and patience, we remember how to bend without breaking, and how to be moved without becoming lost. The next story is called The Monk Who Asked Permission to Vanish. There was once a monk named Rensu who lived at the edge of a quiet monastery. He was not well known for his teachings, nor praised for his wisdom. He swept leaves, poured tea, and folded robes with gentle hands. He bowed slightly lower than needed. He spoke only when spoken to. One day, after years of living this way, Rensu approached the abbot during morning prayers. He bowed deeply and said, "Master, I would like to disappear. May I have your blessing to vanish?" The room grew still. The abbot asked, "Do you wish to die?" Rensu shook his head. "No, but I no longer feel the need to be seen. I wish to live in the forest, to listen to the wind, to speak to the river, to return to being nothing." The other monks were confused. "But Rensu, you are already humble. You already live quietly." Rensu smiled. "Then it should not be hard to let me go." The abbot looked at him for a long moment and then said, "If your heart no longer seeks reflection, then go. But know this vanishing is not escape, it is return." And so Rensu left the next morning without ceremony. No one knew where he went. Some said he walked north into the forest. Others believed he crossed the mountains. Seasons passed. One day, during a deep winter, a traveling monk came to the monastery, carrying a bundle of herbs. "I met a man near the river," he said. "He offered me warmth and silence. He never said his name, but his eyes were empty in the most peaceful way." The abbot nodded and said, "Then he has not vanished. He has only become what he always was." In time, the monks began to notice something odd. The tea seemed warmer. The robes folded themselves. The leaves on the path swept away by wind alone. As if Rensu still passed through, invisible but deeply present. Moral of the story: to vanish is not to be lost. When the self no longer seeks to be noticed, it dissolves into the fabric of life, quiet, soft, and free. Like the monk who asked permission to vanish, true presence often begins the moment we let go of being seen. The next story is called A Wall That Remembered a Whisper. In a forgotten corner of an ancient temple, behind the prayer hall and past the garden overgrown with ivy, stood an old stone wall. It was plain, weathered by rain and time, its surface covered in tiny cracks, like soft wrinkles. Most walked by it without notice, just another part of the past holding up the present. But the monk said the wall remembered things, not with eyes, not with ears, but with presence. Long ago, when the temple was new, a monk stood before this wall each morning to whisper a single prayer. Not loud, not grand, just a few words spoken from a heart carrying sorrow. He had lost someone dear, and he could not speak his grief aloud. So he whispered it into the wall, never expecting answers, only release. Over years, he whispered less, and eventually he stopped coming altogether, but the wall remained. Decades passed. Seasons changed. New monks came, never knowing the story. Yet, from time to time, someone would pause at that wall, drawn by something they couldn't name. They would stand still, and without understanding why, feel the urge to whisper. One day, a young novice named Leon, overwhelmed by doubts and unable to speak her pain, found herself standing before it. She hadn't meant to go there. Her feet had simply led her. The moment she touched the stone, her breath caught. A warmth stirred, not heat, but familiarity, as if the wall had been waiting for her. She leaned in and said nothing at first. Then, barely louder than a breath, she whispered, "I don't know what to do." Nothing replied. No wind, no vision, just stillness. But something within her softened. The silence didn't press, it didn't solve. It simply held her words without weight. She left lighter, not because the wall had answered, but because it had listened. And deep in its stone, the wall remembered another whisper, long ago, that had once sounded the same. Moral of the story: some spaces remember what we try to forget. Like a wall that remembered a whisper, the world can hold our quietest truths without judgment. Sometimes healing begins not when someone speaks back, but when something simply listens and keeps listening. The next story is called The Bellmaker Who Forged Stillness. In a village wrapped in mist and pine trees, there lived an old bellmaker named Toma. He had forged temple bells for over 60 years, each one cast from molten bronze and shaped by devotion, not just fire. His bells were known not for how loud they rang, but for how deeply they echoed. One day, the abbot of a distant mountain temple sent word. They wanted one final bell from Toma, a bell not to call monks to prayer, but to remind them of silence. Toma read the letter and sat quietly for many hours. How do you build a bell for silence? A bell that teaches stillness, not sound. He began slowly, collecting the metals by hand. He did not rush. Each movement was careful, as if the bell was already listening before it existed. But when it came time to carve the inscription, Toma did something strange. He didn't carve words or prayers. He left the surface blank. When asked why, he simply replied, "There is no teaching louder than what we do not say." When the bell was finished, it was beautiful, slim, strong, and graceful. Yet when it was rung for the first time, the sound was soft. It did not carry across the hills. It lingered only near the temple steps, like a breath that didn't wish to travel. Some monks were disappointed. "It should have been louder," they said. "It barely calls us." But the head monk stood beneath the bell with his eyes closed. "It is perfect," he whispered. "It does not call us with force. It invites us to notice what's already here." In time, the bell became the most cherished part of the temple, not for its sound, but for the space it created afterward. After each strike, the silence that followed grew deeper, wider, more awake. As for Toma, he never made another bell. He returned to his cottage and sat in the same chair each day, his hands resting in his lap, not tired, not seeking, just still. Moral of the story: true power does not always speak loudly. Like the bell maker who forged stillness, sometimes our greatest offering is not what we say, but the silence we leave behind. In a world of noise, stillness is not absence, it is presence, fully realized. The next story is called The Stream That Folded Time. At the edge of a forest where light filtered like breath through the leaves, there flowed a narrow stream, quiet, silver, and clear enough to show the clouds above. But this stream was unlike any other. It did not rush, it did not babble, it whispered, and those who listened closely said they sometimes heard voices not of ghosts or spirits, but of moments. A monk named Rio, known for his discipline and doubt, came to the stream after years of seeking truth through scripture and silence. Though admired for his wisdom, Rio felt something missing, a softness, a warmth that never came from words or rituals. He walked to the stream not to learn, but to escape. He knelt and cupped the water in his hands. It felt cool, yet strangely familiar. He looked down and saw not just his reflection, but an image of himself as a child, laughing barefoot in the rain. Then the surface shifted, and he saw his future older, slower, smiling alone beneath a tree. Startled, he pulled back. The stream returned to stillness. "Is this illusion?" he whispered. But something deeper within him stayed quiet, not afraid, just listening. He returned day after day. Sometimes he saw moments he had forgotten, the soft eyes of his mother, the first time he bowed in silence, the night he cried when no one was watching. Other times he saw what had not yet happened, his final breath, a farewell that would come, the kindness he had not yet given. The stream did not speak, but it folded time gently, like a cloth being turned over in loving hands. Past and future touched the present in a single shimmer. One evening, Rio sat beside the stream and wept not from sadness, but from fullness. He understood now. Time is not a straight road. It is a circle of breaths, a stream in which all moments live at once. Moral of the story: time is not only behind or ahead, it is within us. Like the stream that folded time, the present holds all things when we are still enough to notice. The past, the future, the now, they are not separate. When we soften our grip on time, life flows more gently through us. The next story is called Silence Taught by a Sleeping Cat. In the garden behind a quiet Zen temple, a cat lived among the stone lanterns and moss-covered paths. Her fur was soft and grey, her eyes like slow rain, and she was known by no name. She did not belong to anyone, yet no one questioned her presence. She often slept on the sun-warmed step outside the meditation hall, curled into herself as though the world had already given her everything she needed. Monks passed by without disturbing her. Birds landed near her and flew off again. She never moved unless she chose to. A young monk named Nari struggled deeply with meditation. He could not quiet his mind. Every time he sat, thoughts rushed in like wind through bamboo. One morning, in frustration, he approached the head monk. "Master," he said, "I try and try, but silence escapes me. I feel like a failure." The head monk pointed to the garden. "Sit with the cat," he said. "Say nothing. Learn." Nari didn't understand, but he obeyed. He sat beside the sleeping cat as the sun filtered through the trees. The cat did not stir, not even when a leaf landed on her tail, not even when bells rang in the distance. Nari watched her breathe, rise and fall, rise and fall. And slowly, without effort, his own breathing began to match hers. He noticed how she didn't resist the moment. She wasn't chasing peace-ish, was peace. She wasn't trying to be silent, she simply was. Her stillness wasn't forced. It was natural, like water resting in a bowl. For the first time, Nari understood. Silence is not something we make. It is something we return to when we stop trying so hard to reach it. The cat stretched once, yawned without concern, and went back to sleep. Nari bowed not to the cat, but to the teaching she offered without a single word. He returned to the meditation hall. This time, he didn't fight the noise. He let it come, let it pass, and rested within what remained. Moral of the story: silence doesn't always come through effort. Sometimes it arrives when we stop seeking and simply observe. Like a sleeping cat, the most peaceful presence often teaches without words, without movement, just by being what it is, fully and without resistance. The next story is called The Cloud That Sang in Dream. High above, a valley cloaked in mist, a lone cloud floated without purpose. It had no storm to bring, no message to carry, and no shape to hold. While other clouds danced with lightning or poured their gifts upon the earth, this one drifted in silence, forgotten by the sky, unnoticed by the world below. It longed to matter, though it didn't know why. One night, as a temple bell echoed faintly through the valley, the cloud drifted into sleep, a rare thing, even for clouds. In its dream, it hovered over a wide plain, where monks sat in meditation and villagers whispered prayers to the stars. And then, it sang, not with words, not with music, but with something softer, a sound that felt like warmth rising from memory, like a mother's breath, like forgiveness unspoken. The song had no melody, yet every being in the dream heard it in their own language. The monks felt stillness settle deeper into their bones. The villagers smiled without knowing why. Children woke gently from sleep with joy in their chests. The wind paused to listen. Even the earth beneath them seemed to soften. When the cloud woke, it found itself weeping, though clouds do not usually cry for themselves. Something had changed. It felt lighter, fuller, not with water but with meaning. It had not delivered rain or thunder. It had delivered something quieter. It looked below and saw no one noticing. The valley remained still. Yet, somewhere inside it, the cloud knew. The dream was real, not because it happened, but because it left something behind. From that day on, the cloud no longer searched for purpose. It drifted peacefully, its presence calm and kind, its silence a kind of song that no one could hear but many could feel. Moral of the story: some gifts are not seen or measured, only felt. Like the cloud that sang in dream, we may touch lives in ways we never witness. Even in silence, even unseen, we may be singing something the world deeply needs. Meaning is not always loud, it often comes in whispers only the heart can hear. The next story is called The Voice That Lived in a Bowl. In a small mountain temple known more for its quiet than its teachings, there was a wooden bowl passed from monk to monk over generations. It had no carvings, no markings, just the soft curve of age and the warmth of hands that had held it through the years. It was used for morning rice, evening tea, water from the well, and nothing more. But the monks believed something lived inside it, a voice, not of sound, but of memory. A new monk named Taku was given the bowl on his first day. He accepted it with a deep bow, though he did not understand what made it special. It's just a bowl, he thought. It holds, it carries, that is all. Days turned to weeks. Taku used it like any other vessel, though always with care. He washed it gently, dried it in the sun, placed it quietly beside his mat. Still he heard no voice. Nothing spoke, nothing whispered. One day, after a long meditation, Taku sat outside under a cedar tree, staring into the empty bowl. He felt heavy with doubt. Why am I here? He wondered. What am I meant to learn? He turned the bowl in his hands and asked aloud, "What are you trying to teach me?" There was no reply, only silence. But as he looked closer, something shifted. He saw tiny scratches inside the bowl, worn from years of use. He imagined the hands before his young hands, old hands, tired hands, faithful hands. He saw the meals shared, the water poured, the countless mornings that passed through this same vessel. He realized the bowl had never needed to speak. It had listened. It had witnessed. It had carried more than rice seed had carried presence. And in that moment, something inside Taku softened. He no longer asked the bowl to speak. He simply held it, and for the first time, truly heard it. Moral of the story: some voices are not made of sound. They live in what has been held, touched, and honored again and again. Like the voice that lived in a bowl, wisdom often waits quietly in simple things, asking not to be understood, but to be seen with the heart. The next story is called The Scroll That Would Not Unroll. In a secluded temple perched on a mountain edge, there was a scroll kept on the highest shelf of the archive room. Wrapped in golden silk and sealed with a red thread, it was said to contain a teaching so profound that it could awaken the heart in a single reading. But there was one problem: it would not unroll. Many monks tried, gently and with reverence. Some used warmth from their hands, some whispered prayers, others fasted before touching it. But no matter how many tried, the scroll remained tightly coiled, unmoved. Frustration turned to myth. Some believed it was cursed. Others claimed it would open only to the enlightened. Years passed, and the scroll gathered dust. Then came a monk named Kiko, quiet and curious, not known for brilliance or boldness. One rainy afternoon, while cleaning the archives, she noticed the scroll resting quietly above her. She didn't reach for it. She simply bowed. Later that evening, she returned alone, carrying no expectations. She sat beside it and whispered, "It's all right if you never open." She stayed in silence for hours, breathing gently in its presence. She did not touch it. She did not pray. She simply allowed the scroll to be. As dawn painted the sky in soft gold, she stood and began to leave. But as she turned, a quiet sound met her ears, a soft shift, like silk being stirred by memory. She turned back. The scroll had uncoiled just a little, revealing nothing more than the first line. "The teaching begins in your waiting." Kiko smiled and did not open it further. She returned it to its place, still mostly rolled, still mostly hidden. She didn't need the rest, because in the stillness of not knowing, she had already learned what she came for. Moral of the story: not all wisdom needs to be revealed to be real. Like the scroll that would not unroll, some truths wait for our surrender, not our effort. What will not open by force may already be opening something within us. Sometimes the lesson is not in the scroll, but in how we choose to sit beside it. The next story is called The Laugh of an Unopened Flower. In a valley where cherry trees bloomed every spring, there was one small bud that never opened. Year after year, it remained closed, tightly wrapped in its soft green shell, while all the others burst into color. The villagers called it stubborn. "Why won't it bloom?" they asked. "Is it broken? Is it afraid?" But the flower made no excuse. It simply stayed, quiet and unbothered, holding its own rhythm. In the nearby temple, a monk named Hannah heard of the flower and went to see it. She sat beside the tree for an entire afternoon, watching as petals drifted down around her like soft snow. She looked at the unopened bud and whispered, "Are you waiting for something?" The bud said nothing, but just then a strong wind swept through the orchard, scattering blossoms everywhere. Some petals were crushed underfoot, some were carried away. Some bloomed only for a day before falling. And still, the little bud held tight. Days passed, then weeks. The blossoms faded, the orchard returned to green. But one morning, as the sky turned gold with early summer light, the unopened flower gave a soft shake and slowly began to unfold. It did not open in a rush. It opened like a yawn after deep sleep, calm, unhurried, true. Its petals were smaller but brighter, and as the wind touched it gently, it swayed with a joy that felt almost like laughter. A boy passing by said, "It bloomed late." But Hannah, watching from a distance, softly replied, "No, it bloomed right on time." She understood then what the others had not. The flower was never afraid. It was never behind. It was simply listening to its own silence. And when it laughed, it didn't need sound. The opening was enough. Moral of the story: not all things bloom together. Some wait in quiet, listening for the right moment. Like the laugh of an unopened flower, joy doesn't always arrive early or loud, but when it comes, it is honest. Let yourself unfold when you're ready. Not before, not because others have, but because your heart finally says, now. The next story is called A Feather in a Forgotten Breath. In a quiet valley wrapped in fog and dew, where cranes flew low and the wind smelled of memory, there once lived an old woman named Kauru. She was not a monk, not a teacher, not a seeker of truth. She simply lived baking bread each morning, feeding stray cats, and humming songs no one remembered the names of. But every year, on the first day of spring, she would climb the hill behind her cottage and release a single feather into the sky. No one knew why, no one asked. She never explained. One year, a young monk named Sota, restless from too many unanswered questions, left his temple and wandered the countryside searching for a truth he could feel. He passed through Kauru's village on the eve of spring and heard the story of the feather. Curious, he followed her up the hill the next morning. The air was still, the sky soft with light. Kauru held a small white feather between her fingers. Sota asked gently, "Why do you release the feather?" Kauru smiled, her eyes misty but clear. "To return a breath I once forgot to honor." She didn't explain further. She simply closed her eyes, exhaled slowly, and let the feather go. It lifted into the air, dancing without effort, rising like something unburdened. Sota watched in silence. The feather floated until it vanished against the sky, leaving no trace but stillness. Later, he sat with her on the hill, and after a long pause she said softly, "There are moments we rush through words not said, tears not cried, love not noticed. This feather carries one of mine, so I may breathe again, lighter." Sota didn't speak. He had no answer, no teaching to recite. Only a quiet ache in his chest, like something small had shifted, a forgotten breath remembered. Moral of the story: we all carry moments left behind, feelings unspoken, presence unlived. Like a feather in a forgotten breath, healing often begins when we gently release what we once held too tightly or missed altogether. In letting go, we find not loss, but a quieter kind of peace. The next story is called The Monk Who Counted Empty Spaces. In a quiet temple filled with scrolls and ancient bells, there lived a monk named Shoji who did something very few understood. He spent his days counting what was not there. While others recited verses or swept the stone paths, Shoji would sit in the garden, staring at the space between the trees. He would trace the gaps between falling leaves, the pauses between bird songs, the moments between footsteps echoing on the floor. When asked what he was doing, Shoji would smile gently and say, "I'm counting the spaces that hold everything." A young monk named Aki, puzzled by this answer, followed him one morning. Shoji sat still, eyes half closed, counting softly beneath his breath. Aki listened, expecting words or mantras, but heard nothing, just breath, just stillness. Finally, Aki asked, "Why count what cannot be touched?" Shoji replied, "Have you ever heard music without silence? Seen beauty without space around it? Without the pause, the note is just noise." Aki was quiet. Shoji reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small sheet of parchment. On it were several black ink marks, short lines, spaced unevenly. "What do you see?" he asked. Aki replied, "Ink strokes." Shoji smiled. "I see the spaces between them. That is where meaning lives." From that day forward, Aki began to notice things he never had before: the stillness before temple bells rang, the pause in breath before a word, the brief moment of quiet just after a tear falls. These spaces no longer felt empty, they felt alive. Years later, Shoji passed away peacefully in meditation. On the altar, the monks placed no statue, no painting. Only a blank scroll hung in silence, with Shoji's name written once in the corner. Visitors were confused. "Where is the tribute?" they asked. The abbot simply said, "It's all around him." Moral of the story: what we overlook often holds the deepest truths. Like the monk who counted empty spaces, we must learn to see what isn't obvious, because silence gives sound its shape, and emptiness gives life its depth. In the spaces between, we find what matters most. The next story is called The Smile Buried in Dust. In a sun-bleached village, where the wind carried the scent of dry earth and old fires, there stood a shrine nearly lost to time. Its roof had caved in, its offerings had long since crumbled. Dust lay thick across the stone floor, and cobwebs hung like faded prayers. Few remembered who built it, fewer still remembered why. But one boy named Ren passed by the shrine each day on his way to the river. He was quiet, curious, and often sad, though he did not know why. His heart felt heavy in ways he could not explain, like he had misplaced something inside himself long ago. One afternoon, when the sun hung low and the village was quiet, he stepped inside the ruined shrine. The silence there was different, not empty, but waiting. As he wandered the shadows, something caught his eye beneath a blanket of dust, a small carved face in the corner of the altar, barely visible. He knelt, brushed the surface gently, and revealed the faint smile of a forgotten statue. It was not a joyful smile, not wide or bold, just the soft, knowing kind, the kind you see on someone who understands pain but no longer fights it. Something in Ren stirred. He did not know who the statue was meant to be. He did not need to. That quiet smile, hidden for so long beneath dust, felt like something that had lived inside him, too buried by years, forgotten beneath worry, covered by silence. He sat beside it for hours, saying nothing, only breathing. The next day, he brought a small flower. The day after that, a bowl of water. He never spoke to the statue. But over time, others began to stop, as well offering a moment, a bow, a breath. The shrine was never restored. It remained broken, but the dust grew thinner, and the smile was no longer hidden. Moral of the story: even what has been forgotten still remembers us. Like the smile buried in dust, parts of ourselves wait quietly beneath the noise, tender, enduring, whole. We do not always need to fix what's broken. Sometimes we only need to uncover what was always there. The next story is called The River That Lost Its Way Home. There was once a river that flowed joyfully through hills and meadows, singing over stones, feeding roots, and carrying the light of the sky. It had always known its path curving gently, rushing boldly, moving with certainty toward the great sea. But one spring, after heavy rains and fallen trees, the land shifted. The river bent in a strange direction. It no longer recognized the mountains. The trees were unfamiliar. The sky felt too wide. "I have lost my way," the river whispered. "This is not home." It tried to turn back, but water never flows backward, so it kept moving, uncertain and afraid, through dry valleys and narrow cracks. Animals stopped coming to drink. The grasses along its banks withered. Even the birds flew above it without stopping. "Am I still a river?" it wondered. "If I no longer know where I'm going?" Far away, a wandering monk was walking through the hills. He came upon the river thin, quiet, and slow. He knelt beside it and dipped his hands into the water. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply drank, smiled, and bowed to the river as if it had done something beautiful. The river, startled by this kindness, asked softly, "Why thank me? I've lost my course." The monk looked up and replied, "You may not know where you're going, but you're still flowing. You still offer, you still give, and that is enough." The river wept, though no one could see its tears were already part of itself. From that day on, it stopped searching for the sea. It flowed where the earth allowed, sometimes wide, sometimes narrow, but always present. And in time, new roots grew at its edges. Birds returned. Children played in its shallows. It had not found the sea, but it had found something just as deep, peace with its path. Moral of the story: losing direction doesn't mean losing purpose. Like the river that lost its way home, we may not always flow where we expected, but we still nourish, still move, still matter. The journey may change, but the giving heart remains. And sometimes, not reaching the sea is how we learn to love the land. The next story is called Tea Leaves That Read Themselves. In a mountainside village wrapped in mist and pine, there lived an old tea master named Jun. He was known not for the way he brewed tea, but for the way he listened to it. Travelers came from far places, not just to drink, but to have their tea leaves read, hoping to find answers in the patterns left at the bottom of the cup. Jun never made predictions. He never said what would happen next. Instead, he would simply stare into the empty cup, nod slowly, and say, "They already know." One day, a young woman named May arrived, her heart full of questions. She had left behind a life that no longer fit, but didn't yet know who she was without it. She sat before Jun and asked, "Will the tea tell me who I'm becoming?" Jun smiled gently, brewed the tea, and poured it into her cup. She drank in silence, letting the warmth settle inside her. When she handed the empty cup back, her hands trembled not from fear, but from longing. Jun peered into the leaves. Then, instead of speaking, he slid the cup back to her. "Look," he said, "not with your eyes, but with your breath." May leaned in. The leaves formed no shape she could name, no map, no future. But something in her chest began to soften. She saw a swirl that reminded her of a river she once swam in as a child, a curve like her mother's smile, a cluster that felt like the confusion she'd carried for months, still present, but less frightening now. And then she realized. The tea wasn't answering her. It was showing her that she had already been speaking all along. Jun nodded. "You do not need someone to tell you what you are. You need only to sit still long enough to hear yourself." She bowed with tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet relief of remembering her own voice. Moral of the story: sometimes we search for signs outside of us, hoping for clarity. But like the tea leaves that read themselves, truth often arises when we stop asking and start listening to memory, to feeling, to silence. The answers are not hidden. They are waiting to be heard. The next story is called The Gate That Waited for the Wind. At the edge of an old forest monastery stood a wooden gate, weathered by time and untouched by footsteps. It was built long ago, but no one remembered why. It led to no road, no path, just wild grass and scattered stones beyond it. Most monks passed it without thought. But the gate remained, quiet, upright, waiting. Some whispered that it was unfinished, others said it was a mistake. "Why build a gate that opens to nothing?" a young monk once asked. The elder only smiled and replied, "Some things are not built to lead, they are built to receive." Each morning, the gate would creak softly, as if sighing into the morning light. The wind would pass through it, stirring the grass on the other side. Birds landed on its frame. Leaves brushed its corners. But still no one walked through it. One autumn evening, the sky turned golden and the wind began to rise. It wasn't loud or strong, just steady. It moved through the temple halls, through trees and robes, and finally through the gate. This time the gate moved, just slightly. It opened without hands, slow and gentle, as if greeting someone unseen. A monk named Ren, who often walked the temple grounds in silence, witnessed it. He stood still and watched as the wind passed through, then disappeared into the tall grass. The gate closed slowly behind it. Ren bowed to the gate. Later, when asked what he saw, he said, "I saw a gate remember its purpose not to welcome people, but to welcome presence." From then on, the monks no longer ignored the gate. Some sat beside it in meditation. Others placed flowers at its base. It had not changed, but now it was seen, not as a doorway to somewhere, but as a reminder of something sacred, waiting without needing. Moral of the story: not everything must be useful to be meaningful. Like the gate that waited for the wind, some things exist not to lead us forward, but to invite us to pause. Stillness itself is a kind of welcome. When we stop asking, "What for?" we begin to hear what's always passing through. The next story is called The Pebble Balanced on Moonlight. Near the edge of a quiet lake, where the water stayed still even when the wind moved, there was a single pebble placed delicately on top of a smooth, flat stone. It was so small, so plain, that most people didn't notice it, but monks from the nearby temple whispered about it during evening prayers. They said no one had placed the pebble there. It had simply appeared one night, balanced so perfectly that it didn't fall, even when the rains came or birds landed nearby. What made it strange wasn't how it stayed, but when it glowed. Only under moonlight did the pebble shine. It didn't sparkle like a gem, it didn't demand attention, but something in its quiet shimmer stirred people's hearts. Some said they saw their childhood in it. Others felt grief soften just by sitting beside it. No one could explain why. A young monk named Tatsu grew fascinated by the pebble. He sat beside it night after night, watching, waiting. He asked the elders, "What makes it glow like that?" One elder replied, "It doesn't glow, you do. The pebble just reflects what you forget to see in yourself." Tatsu frowned. "But it's only under the moon." The elder nodded. "Because only in soft light do we learn to see softly." Tatsu stopped asking after that. He simply visited the pebble each night and breathed. One evening, burdened by thoughts he couldn't name, he sat longer than usual. The moon rose higher, and the pebble shone gently, as if nodding to something inside him, something unspoken, but deeply known. He realized then that balance isn't always loud or visible. Sometimes it's a single breath held steady, a moment of stillness between doubt and peace. He never touched the pebble. He never needed to. Moral of the story: true balance is quiet, like a pebble resting on moonlight, simple, steady, and unnoticed until we stop and see. We search for stability in grand ways, but sometimes it's found in the smallest things. When we learn to be still, even in darkness, we begin to glow too. The next story is called The Door That Opened Backward. In a hilltop monastery wrapped in wind and wildflowers, there was a door unlike any other. It stood at the far end of the meditation hall, carved of dark wood and worn by time. It was not locked, yet few used it because when pulled, it did not open outward, it opened backward. Many tried to pass through and failed. Some pushed, some knocked, others gave up altogether. The door remained closed, not because it refused them, but because they pulled it the wrong way. One day, a monk named Nyoko stood before the door after years of seeking clarity. Her journey had taken her through long retreats, deep silences, and more questions than answers. Still, something felt unfinished, like truth was always just beyond her grasp. She approached the strange door, and like many before her, pulled. It did not move. She sighed. An elder monk nearby watched quietly and said, "Why must all doors open forward?" Nyoko turned to him, puzzled. "Isn't that the way we go outward, onward?" The monk smiled gently. "Not always. Some paths open behind us, not ahead. Some awakenings come not by stepping forward, but by turning within." Naoko paused. Then, slowly, she stepped back, not away from the door, but inward toward herself. She let go of her effort, of her need to advance. She stopped searching for the next thing. And then she simply reached for the handle again, but this time pulled the door toward herself. It opened with ease. Beyond it, there was no grand hall, no revelation. Just a small garden bathed in soft morning light. Still, ordinary, beautiful. She stepped through, not with triumph, but with a quiet breath. The lesson had never been in the garden. It had been in the motion, the moment she stopped forcing forward and allowed herself to return. Moral of the story: not all progress looks like movement ahead. Like the door that opened backward, some truths require us to step inward, not outward. When we stop rushing forward, we often find that the way was behind us all along, waiting for us to come home to ourselves. The next story is called The Stone Carved from Absence. In the courtyard of a temple surrounded by mountains and mist, there stood a small, unusual statue. Unlike the others, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, lions, this one had no face, no hands, no inscription. It was simply a stone with a hollow carved right through its center. People often walked past it without pause, mistaking it for a broken piece of something once whole. But it was not broken. It had been made that way, shaped not by what was added, but by what had been removed. One day, a novice monk named Emiko sat before the stone, puzzled. "Why leave a hole where form should be?" she asked the elder monk beside her. He replied, "Because not everything speaks through presence. Some truths are carved by what is taken away." Still confused, Emiko began to observe the statue daily. She noticed how wind passed through the hollow space without resistance, how sunlight filtered through it in the late afternoon, casting perfect circles on the temple floor, how children laughed as they peeked through it, framing the world with emptiness. And slowly she began to understand. The space in the center was not missing, it was the message. That night, as she sat in meditation, Emiko reflected not on what she wanted to gain, but what she wished to release: the old hurt, the need to be right, the weight of being seen. And as each breath passed through her, she imagined herself being hollowed gently by life, not broken, but lightened. She whispered, "Let there be space in me too." The next morning, she bowed before the statue, no because it was whole, but because it wasn't. Moral of the story: wholeness does not always come from what we add. Like the stone carved from absence, we are often shaped by what we let go of: fear, pride, expectations. True form is not about being full, it's about being open. And in that openness, something quiet and sacred begins to shine through. The next story is called A Cloud Drinking Ink. In a valley where poets once wandered and inkstones sat warm in the hands of sages, there was an old calligrapher named Haku. He wrote slowly, not for fame or beauty, but to feel each word unfold like breath. He believed that every stroke carried a piece of the soul, so he never rushed and he never rewrote. Each morning, he sat by the window with his brush and paper, watching the clouds drift across the mountains. One morning, while dipping his brush in ink, a sudden breeze scattered his parchment across the floor. As he knelt to gather them, a drop of ink spilled onto the sill, and just then, a cloud passed low across the sky. In that quiet moment, the ink vanished, not smeared, not blown away, gone. Haku blinked. The drop had dissolved upward, as if the cloud had taken it. He smiled, half amused, half moved. That night, he dreamed of the same cloud hovering above his home, gently absorbing words from the pages he had written over the years, soaking up the griefs he never voiced, the joys he never claimed, and the questions he had long since stopped asking. In the dream, the cloud spoke without sound. What you cannot say, I will carry. What you cannot keep, I will hold. When Haku awoke, he did not search for meaning. He simply picked up his brush and wrote with a softness he had never known. He stopped worrying about what to say or how it looked. He wrote for the cloud, for the sky, for the silence. And from that day on, his papers grew lighter, his words fewer, his lines more open, more empty, but never hollow. Each evening, he left a page by the window. Whether the wind took it or the cloud drank it, he no longer cared. What mattered was the offering. Moral of the story: not everything we carry must be spoken. Like a cloud drinking ink, the world has ways of receiving what we cannot say. Letting go is not forgetting it, is trusting that even unspoken truths can find their place in the sky. The next story is called The Book That Was Never Written Yet Always Read. In the heart of a mist-covered monastery stood a shelf lined with old scrolls and sacred texts. Among them sat a single blank book. Its cover was dark and soft with age, its pages untouched by ink. The monks never opened it to read. They only bowed to it before studying anything else. It had no title, no author, no words. A young monk named Sota, curious and sincere, once asked the librarian, "Why do we honor a book that says nothing?" The old librarian looked up, eyes gentle. "Because silence was the first teacher," he said, "and some lessons are too true for words." Sota remained confused. Wasn't a book meant to explain, to guide? He decided to open it when no one was watching. Late one evening, he knelt before the shelf. He reached for the silent book and slowly opened the first page. Nothing, just a soft, empty white. He turned the next, and the next. Page after page blank. But something strange began to happen. As he turned each page, his mind slowed. His heart quieted. He stopped thinking about what he hoped to find and began noticing what was already there: his breath, the flicker of candlelight, the sound of wind beyond the paper walls. By the last page, he felt something he hadn't in years, peace without reason, stillness without question. He closed the book, tears touching his cheeks, not from sadness, but from the quiet relief of no longer needing answers. From then on, Sota sat before the book each day, not to learn anything new, but to remember what he already knew deep inside. That presence needs no explanation. Other monks began to join him. They too sat before the blank book, not to read it, but to be read by it. Moral of the story: some truths are beyond words. Like the book that was never written yet always read, the deepest wisdom often lives in silence, presence, and being. When we stop looking for answers, we begin to feel what's been with us all along the quiet page of the heart, already open. The next story is called The Monk's Whisper Heard by Stars. In a mountain temple where lamps burned low and wind sang through pine, there lived an old monk named Sogen. He had spoken less and less with each passing year, not because he had no thoughts, but because he found fewer and fewer words that felt necessary. Each night, he climbed the stone steps to the temple roof, wrapped in a faded robe, and looked up at the sky. He never prayed aloud. He never asked for answers. He simply whispered soft, breath-like murmurs, carried upward by nothing but silence. Other monks asked, "Who are you whispering to?" Sogen only smiled. "To the stars," he said. "They listen better than people do." One young novice, curious and unsure, followed him one evening and sat beside him in the dark. "What do you say?" the boy asked. "Nothing loud," Sogen replied. "Only what my heart can't hold in daylight." The novice nodded but said nothing. Together they sat, watching stars flicker gently like candles too far to reach. Then, without thinking, the boy whispered his own words into the night words of fear, longing, and quiet hope. The wind stirred. The stars did not move. But the boy felt heard, not by sound, not by reply but by space. Years later, after Sogen had passed, the young mono-grown took his place on the rooftop. He said nothing, just closed his eyes, opened his heart, and let a whisper rise like breath into the dark. Somewhere in the vastness, he felt a whisper return not as words, but as peace. Moral of the story: some truths are too gentle for speech. Like the monk's whisper heard by stars, the most sacred offerings are not meant to be answered, they're meant to be released. When we speak softly into silence, the universe listens in its own quiet way, and sometimes the echo is simply a feeling that we are not alone. The next story is called The Hand That Poured Nothing. In a temple where tea was a form of meditation, a ritual was practiced every afternoon, a silent tea ceremony where one monk would serve and the others would receive without words. It was not about the drink itself, it was about attention, gratitude, presence in the act. One day, a new monk named Isamu was chosen to serve. He was nervous but honored. All morning, he rehearsed the movements in his mind, the bow, the pour, the gentle placement of the cup. He reminded himself, this is sacred. When the moment came, Isamu approached the first monk, bowed, and lifted the kettle. But he hadn't noticed there was no tea inside. The kettle was empty. He froze. Panic rushed in. His face grew hot. He looked to the elder monk, expecting correction, perhaps even laughter. But the elder simply closed his eyes and raised his hands in acceptance, as if nothing were wrong. Isamu hesitated, then slowly tilted the empty kettle. No liquid came, just silence. He placed the empty cup before the elder, bowed again, and moved to the next monk. One by one, he poured nothing into their cups. One by one, they accepted. After the ceremony, Isamu bowed deeply in apology. "I have failed," he whispered. "I offered nothing." The elder touched his shoulder and said, "You offered fully." Isamu looked up, confused. But there was no tea. The elder smiled. "Still, your hand poured, your heart bowed. And we received not tea, but presence. You gave more than flavor. You gave attention, intention, and we were filled." From that day forward, a new tradition quietly began. Once a month, one monk would offer the empty pura reminder that the deepest nourishment is not always in what's given, but in how it is offered. Moral of the story: giving does not always need form. Like the hand that poured nothing, what matters is not the gift, but the heart behind it. Presence, sincerity, and stillness can fill more than any object ever could. Sometimes, nothing is the most generous offering of all. The next story is called A mask worn by the wind. There was once a traveling monk named Kisho who wandered through forests, deserts, and villages wearing a carved wooden mask. It was smooth and simple, painted with a calm expression, neither smiling nor frowning. He wore it always, even while eating, walking, or sitting in silence beneath trees. Children would run behind him, curious. Elders would stare, puzzled. Some said he hid his sorrow. Others believed he had forgotten his true face. But Kisho never explained. He moved with gentleness, bowed deeply, and spoke only when necessary. One day, as he walked along a mountain pass, a fierce wind began to rise. It howled through the pines, tugged at his robes, and finally lifted the mask from his face, sending it tumbling into the ravine below. The monk froze. For the first time in many years, his bare face met the sky. No one else was there to see it. Only the wind remained slow now, quiet, as if it had taken what it needed and left something lighter behind. Kisho sat down on a nearby rock. He placed his hand on his cheek, not in shame, but in wonder. Have I hidden, he thought, or have I been carried? He remembered the day he first carved the mask not to escape himself, but to survive a grief too large to name. The mask had become a companion, a boundary, a soft protection. He had not worn it out of fear, but out of care for himself, for others. As he sat, the wind circled back gently, brushing his skin like an old friend. He whispered, "You wore it too, didn't you?" The wind made no sound, but Kisho knew the answer. He never carved another mask. He simply continued walking, this time with his face uncovered, weathered, soft, open. Some people still looked at him with curiosity, others with compassion, but he no longer needed to explain who he was. The wind had returned what he had always carried, himself. Moral of the story: we all wear masks, some made of silence, some of kindness, some of fear, but like a mask worn by the wind, their purpose is not always to hide, but to hold us until we are ready to be seen. And when we are, even the wind will let go. The next story is called The Feather That Refused to Land. On a crisp autumn morning, a feather was seen drifting high above the temple grounds. Carried by a light breeze, it twirled gracefully, always just out of reach. It had fallen from a white crane that had vanished into the clouds, but the feather didn't fall like the others. It lingered. Monks looked up and watched. Children chased it with outstretched hands, laughing. Days passed, then weeks, and still the feather floated through the temple, air gliding along roofs, dipping near trees, brushing the tops of lanterns, but never touching the earth. Some believed it was caught in a spell. Others said it had a purpose, yet unfulfilled. But the oldest monk, Dason, simply smiled and said, "It is not lost. It is listening." A young monk named Ray became obsessed with the feather. "Why won't it land?" she asked Dason one day. "Doesn't it want rest? Doesn't it want to belong somewhere?" Dason replied, "Perhaps it belongs to the sky. Not everything must arrive to be complete." One day, a storm came. The trees shook, the sky wept, and winds howled across the mountain. Ray ran to the temple garden, eyes searching for the feather. She thought for sure it would be gone, blown away, or finally fallen. But there, beneath the eaves, it hovered motionless, suspended in the space between wind and gravity. And then it rose. Not fell, not dropped. It lifted higher, disappearing into the fog. Ray stood silent, hands pressed together, something in her heart opening wide, not from understanding, but from surrender. That night, she wrote only one line in her journal. "Some souls are not meant to arrive, only to remind us that we, too, can float." Moral of the story: not every journey ends in landing. Like the feather that refused to touch the ground, some paths exist only to show us how to move gently through life, without clinging to it. Let go of the need to arrive. Sometimes, simply drifting with grace is the lesson itself. The next story is called The Teacup That Remembered Autumn. In a small mountain temple wrapped in cedar trees, there was a single teacup unlike the others. It was chipped along the rim, its glaze faded, and a faint crack ran down one side. No one used it anymore. It sat on the highest shelf of the tea room, quietly collecting dust. But the cup remembered. It remembered the monk who once chose it every day. His name was Daigo. He never cared for the newer cups, the polished ones. He said this one held warmth better, like hands that have learned to let go. He used the cup every autumn. Daigo would sit by the open window as red leaves fell and steam rose from the kettle. He never rushed the pour, never stirred the silence. He would lift the cup slowly, smile without words, and take a sip that seemed to reach somewhere beyond taste. The cup remembered his hands firm, gentle, slightly trembling in his later years. And when Daigo passed, no one wanted the old cup. It was too cracked, too fragile. They left it on the shelf like a memory too quiet to hold. Years later, a young monk named Mio found it while cleaning. She reached for a newer cup, but paused. Something about the old one felt familiar. She brought it down, washed it carefully, and poured tea into it. As she lifted it to her lips, the cup, though silent, spoke not with words, but with presence. The warmth felt deeper, the silence fuller. Outside, a single red leaf fell across the window's edge. Mio sat without drinking. She closed her eyes. Something in her softened, as if an old grief she didn't know she carried had just been held for her. She didn't know Daigo, but the cup did, and it passed on not his name, but his stillness. Moral of the story: even the quietest things can remember us. Like the teacup that remembered autumn, the objects we touch with care hold more than function, they hold presence. And when touched again, they offer it back. Stillness, like memory, doesn't fade. It only waits to be held once more. The next story is called The Echo That Refused to Echo. Deep within a quiet canyon, known for its perfect acoustics, monks would travel from distant temples just to hear their voices return to them. They would chant into the stone walls, and their words would come back clear, full, and unchanged. Many said it felt like hearing their soul reply. But one day, a monk named Jun spoke, and nothing came back. He had stepped into a narrow crevice where the wind whispered gently and the rocks rose tall around him. He called out a verse he had spoken many times before. The silence that followed was still and vast, no echo, no sound, just the weight of emptiness. Confused, Jun tried again. Louder, sharper. He recited entire sutras into the air, but the canyon gave him nothing. He returned to the group and told them, "This place does not return my voice. It is broken." An elder monk who had once been silent for a full year turned to him and said, "No, it is listening." Jun frowned. "But it says nothing. Perhaps it is asking you to say something different," the elder replied. "Or nothing at all." That night, Jun went back alone. He sat in the same crevice where his voice had vanished. But this time, he did not speak. He placed his palms together, lowered his eyes, and simply breathed. In the quiet, something shifted. He began to hear the canyon not with his ears, but with his whole being. The wind brushing stone, the soft drip of water, his own heartbeat. And in that soundless space, he felt deeply heard for the first time, without needing to be answered. He smiled. He whispered, "Thank you." And though no echo came, something inside him replied. Moral of the story: we do not always need to be answered to be understood. Like the echo that refused to echo, silence can be the greatest teacher. When nothing comes back, it does not mean we are alone. It may mean we are finally being listened to, deeply, and without interruption. The next story is called The Sand Grain That Waited 1,000 Years. On a forgotten shore, far beyond the eyes of fishermen or monks, there lay a single grain of sand. It was not special in size or shape. It did not sparkle. But it held something that no other grain around it seemed to carry: patience. Once, long ago, this grain had been part of a towering cliff, high above the ocean. It had watched storms crash, birds nest, and stars wheel through the sky. But over time, wind and water carved away its edges, wore it down, broke it free, and carried it far from where it began. Now it lay among countless others, small and silent, unnoticed. The other grains moved with the wind, rushed with the tide, eager to become something again: part of a castle, a glass window, a path beneath travelers' feet. But this grain did not move. It waited, not out of fear, but because something in it remembered that not all journeys are forward. Some are downward, inward, quieter than motion. One day, a monk named Suna walked barefoot along the shore. He often came here to release thoughts too heavy for the temple walls. As he walked, he paused, bent down, and gently scooped a handful of sand. Among the millions, his gaze landed on one grain, ordinary, resting quietly in the center of his palm. He sat, and for hours he said nothing. He didn't know why, but holding that grain of sand stilled him in a way no scroll or bell had done. He remembered his mother's silence, the space between breath and thought, the weight of waiting without needing to be found. Before leaving, he returned the sand to the earth, but he bowed, as if it had spoken. The grain remained still, and in its stillness, it had fulfilled something greater than form it had been seen. Moral of the story: not all things must become something else. Like the sand grain that waited 1,000 years, some beings carry purpose simply in their stillness. They teach not by changing, but by remaining until one soul looks close enough to feel the quiet they have held for lifetimes. The next story is called A Path Built by Footsteps Not Taken. In a dense forest behind the monastery, countless trails wound through the treesome, well worn by pilgrims, others faint and fading. But beyond them all was a place known only by the elders, the path that was never walked. There were no stones laid, no signs, no footprints. Yet, oddly, the monks said it was the most sacred path of all. A young monk named Mika grew curious. "How can a path exist," she asked the abbot, "if no one has ever walked it?" The abbot placed a single leaf in her hand and said, "Because some paths are built not by steps, but by choices. Go, see." So Mika entered the forest at dawn. She reached a fork where one path curved left, trampled and clear. Another path veered right, narrow but visible. But then she noticed a third Spacino path, just thick grass and shadows. She paused. Her foot hovered above the ground. She almost stepped, but something in her heart told her not to. Instead, she stood still and listened. Wind moved through the trees. A bird cried out once, then silence. She turned around and walked back. When she returned, the abbot smiled. "You found it." "But I didn't take it," she said. "I chose not to." "And that was the step," the abbot replied. "Not all journeys begin with movement. Some paths appear only in the turning away." Years later, Mika would teach this to new monks, not by leading them, but by giving them choices. And sometimes, when asked where the sacred path lay, she would smile and say, "I cannot show you, I only know where it isn't." Moral of the story: sometimes, the most powerful steps are the ones we don't take. Like a path built by footsteps not taken, wisdom often grows in restraint, not pursuit. What you choose not to follow may shape you more than what you chase. In silence, in pause, in walking away, another kind of path is quietly made. The next story is called The Smile Before Awakening. In a temple where dawn was greeted with silence rather than sound, the monks would rise each day before the sun, light incense, and sit in deep meditation. Among them was a monk named Kiku, who had been practicing for many years, seeking one thing: awakening. He read the sutras, he followed the breath, he fasted, served, and prayed. Yet something always felt just beyond reach. The more he tried to grasp enlightenment, the more distant it seemed. One morning, before the others stirred, Kiku sat alone in the garden. The stars were still visible, the lanterns were out. His legs ached. His thoughts returned to the same old question: when will it come? He closed his eyes tightly, willing his mind to stop. But in that effort, he felt only strain, frustration. Silence pressed on his chest like weight. Then, from the corner of the garden, a small sound, barely more than a breath. Kiku opened his eyes. An elderly monk, Genjo, had been sitting nearby all along, unnoticed. He had fallen asleep upright, his chin tucked to his chest, hands resting in his lap. And just then, he smiled. Not at anyone, not at a thought, just a soft, effortless smile, one that arrived like a breeze through trees. And in that smile, something shifted in Kiku. He didn't understand it, but he felt it. The smile held no answer, no goal, no grasp. It was peace snow after awakening, but before it. Kiku's shoulders softened, his breath settled, and he smiled, too, not because he had found the truth, but because he no longer needed to chase it. For the first time, he simply sat, not seeking, not waiting, just being. The sky began to pale with morning light, and though the world looked the same, Kiku knew something inside him had quietly opened. He would later tell no one what changed, only that it started with a smile, small, real, and free of reason. Moral of the story: awakening isn't always thunder or light. Sometimes it begins in something as gentle as a smile. Like the smile before awakening, peace often arrives not after struggle, but in the moment we stop searching and allow stillness to soften the heart. The next story is called The Fish Who Dreamed of Sitting Zazen. In a clear pond beside the old Zen temple, a single silver fish lived in the shadows of lily pads. He was not like the others who chased ripples and darted through reeds. This fish, named Koi by the monks, spent most of his days gazing upward toward the temple steps, where the monks sat in stillness, motionless like stones in the wind. Koi watched them with wonder. "What are they doing?" he asked the dragonflies. "They are meditating," the dragonflies replied. "They call it zazen. They sit and become quiet inside." Koi blinked. "I wish I could do that." The dragonflies laughed. "But you are a fish. You never stop swimming. How can you sit?" Koi didn't answer. That night, under the moonlight, he tried. He swam to the stillest corner of the pond and tucked his fins close to his sides. He floated without moving, eyes wide, breath soft. The water around him calmed. For the first time, the world didn't spin. The reeds stopped whispering. The pond no longer pulled him forward. He simply was. A monk named Haru, walking by with a lantern, paused. He looked down and saw the little fish completely still, glowing faintly beneath the water, like a pearl resting in breath. Haru sat beside the pond and joined him in silence. Minutes passed. Neither moved. Monk and fishone on land, one in water, shared the same stillness. Afterward, Haru whispered, "Thank you, little teacher." The next day, the monks began saying that Koi was different. Not just calm, but wise. And though he never spoke, his presence taught more than many sutras. Children who came to visit would sit beside the pond and try to match his stillness. Some said their hearts grew quieter just watching him. Koi never stopped being a fish. He still swam. But each evening, as the light softened and the wind grew kind, he returned to his corner, folded his fins, and sat. Moral of the story: stillness isn't about the shape of your body, it's about the shape of your heart. Like the fish who dreamed of sitting zazen, peace is not reserved for monks or mountains. It lives wherever you choose to pause, breathe, and be. The next story is called The Gate Made of Breath. There was once a wandering monk named Tenzin who searched across mountains and valleys for the sacred gate of enlightenmenta, passage spoken of only in old poems and whispered teachings. Some said it was carved from jade. Others said it shimmered like air, but all agreed to pass through it was to awaken. Tenzin journeyed for years. He climbed peaks where the sky froze his skin. He crossed deserts where silence pressed like stone. At every temple he asked the same question: where is the gate? Some monks smiled and said nothing. Others pointed in opposite directions. Still, he pressed on. One evening, exhausted and dust-covered, Tenzin arrived at a small hermitage nestled in a grove of wind-shaped trees. An old woman tended a fire outside. She looked up and said, "You're late. You've been walking in circles." Startled, Tenzin asked, "Do you know the gate?" She nodded slowly. "It's just ahead." Heart pounding, he followed her. But she led him not to a structure, not to a path, but to a flat stone. She motioned for him to sit. "Close your eyes," she whispered, "and breathe." Confused but obedient, Tenzin sat cross-legged. The wind quieted. The night grew still. "Inhale," she said. He did. "Exhale." He let go. Again and again. Nothing happened, until something did. He noticed how his breath met silence like waves meeting shore, how his body softened, how his thoughts no longer pulled. He sat in the rhythm of being, not doing. And as the breath deepened, a strange feeling came grand, not loud, but true. He had passed through something. When he opened his eyes, there was no gate, just the night, the trees, the soft crackle of fire. But he was not the same. "You walked far," the woman said, "but the gate was always within you. Breath is the threshold, stillness is the key." Tenzin bowed, not to her but to the invisible gate he had finally stepped through. Moral of the story: the greatest thresholds are not made of stone or wood. Like the gate made of breath, true passage happens within each inhale, a door, each exhale, a release. When we stop seeking something to walk through, we discover we've been breathing through it all along. The next story is called A Bell That Sounded When Forgotten. Long ago, deep in the mountains, there was a small meditation hall where a single bell hung above the entrance. It was made of dark metal and had no rope, no hammer. It had not been rung in years. Visitors would pass beneath it without notice. Monks bowed to the altar, not the bell. Over time, its purpose was lost to memory. It simply became part of the ceiling quiet, untouched, forgotten. A young monk named Nami was new to the temple. She asked the elder, "Why does no one ring the bell?" The elder smiled and replied, "It rings only when no one expects it." Nami thought it was a riddle. She returned each morning, staring up at the bell. She waited in silence. She tried clapping her hands. She tried chanting softly beneath it. Still, no sound came. Eventually, she stopped going. Her attention turned elsewhere, to sweeping, to breathing, to sitting without seeking. Seasons passed. One cool morning, as the mist lingered low and the sky remained pale, Nami stepped through the temple gate without thinking of the bell at all. Her heart was calm, her mind still. Her breath matched the quiet of the mountain, and as she passed beneath the bell it rang, just once, a clear, soft tone that rippled through the stone floor, through her bones, through the air itself. The monks inside turned their heads. Birds lifted from the trees, and Nami stood completely still, tears touching her eyes, not from shock, but from something she couldn't name. The elder appeared behind her. "You stopped trying," he said gently, and so it spoke. From then on, no one tried to make the bell ring, but every few years, when someone passed through with a heart emptied of effort and a mind softened by presence, it sounded again. Moral of the story: some truths speak only when we stop seeking. Like a bell that sounds when forgotten, the deepest awakenings come not through force, but surrender. When we release the need to control, the moment reveals itself not with noise, but with grace. Let go and listen. The next story is called The Hand That Held the Wind. In a small temple where the mountains met the sky, a child named Sora was left in the care of the monks. She was quiet, curious, and often seen chasing the breeze across the temple, grounds arms outstretched, fingers open, trying to catch what could never be caught. The monks watched with gentle smiles. "She will learn," they said. One morning, the head monk found Sora sitting beneath the plum tree, her hands cupped tightly together, pressed to her chest. Her eyes were wide with wonder. "I did it," she whispered. "I held the wind." The monk knelt beside her. "May I see?" Sora opened her hands carefully, but of course there was nothing, only air. She looked up, confused. "It was here, I felt it." The monk nodded. "And now that you've opened your hands, what do you feel?" She paused, then said quietly, "Still the wind, but softer." The monk smiled. "That is the secret. You cannot hold the wind, but you can feel it, carry it, let it move through you. The more tightly you try to grip it, the more it slips away." Sora looked at her palms. They were empty. And yet, she had never felt them so full. From that day on, she stopped chasing the wind. Instead, she walked slowly, arms at her side, and let it meet her on its own, whispering through her sleeves, dancing in her hair. She came to understand that some things are not meant to be caught, only welcomed. Years later, long after she became a teacher herself, students would ask, "How do we hold peace? How do we keep joy?" She would smile and open her hand. Moral of the story: not everything can be held. Like the hand that held the wind, the most precious experiences are felt, not possessed. When we loosen our grip on needing to hold life still, we begin to feel it fully. The wind is never gone, it is only free. Let it pass through you, and be grateful it came. The next story is called The Monk Who Answered with a Shadow. In a mountain temple where snow fell like whispers and pine trees stood like prayers, there lived a monk named Kaido, known not for what he said, but for what he didn't. Pilgrims traveled long distances to ask questions about life, death, suffering, peace. But Kaido never gave direct answers. Instead, he would raise his hands slowly and point to the floor where his shadow rested soft, still, shaped by the flicker of candlelight or the slant of the sun. Many left puzzled. "Does he mock us with silence?" they asked. "Why point to a shadow?" One autumn evening, a young seeker named May arrived, her heart aching with grief. She sat across from Kaido and asked with trembling voice, "Why does pain stay even when I understand it?" Kaido said nothing. He simply lit a lamp behind her. As the light fell across the floor, May saw her own shadow beside his. Two silhouettes, quiet and long, stretching into the room. She waited, but Kaido only looked at the shadows, then looked at her and bowed. May stared at the shape of her own sorrow cast in light. For the first time, she noticed something. The shadow didn't move on its own. It followed. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't real either. It was not who she was. Just a shape made by what stood between her and the light. She didn't speak. She simply bowed back. Later, as she prepared to leave, she whispered, "Thank you for not answering." Kaido smiled. "I did answer," he said softly. "You just didn't use your ears." Years later, Mei would sit with others in grief, and when they asked her questions she could not answer, she would light a candle behind them and wait. Moral of the story: some truths cannot be spoken. Like the monk who answered with a shadow, wisdom sometimes appears not through words, but through what we see when we stop needing explanation. Pain, like shadow, follows, but it is not the self. Step into the light and watch what fades quietly behind you. The next story is called The Monk Who Answered with a Shadow. In a temple where questions were welcomed more than answers, a monk named Senzu was known for never speaking during teachings. He sat at the back of the meditation hall, old and quiet, his robe faded, his gaze gentle. Students often wondered if he had forgotten words altogether. One day, a young novice stood before the gathered monks and asked a question that had burdened her heart. "How do I let go of the self without disappearing?" No one answered. The abbot simply turned and nodded toward Senzu. All eyes turned to the old monk. Senzu slowly stood. He did not speak. He walked to the wall of the temple, where the late sun cast a pale light. Without saying a word, he raised his hand and let it fall again. The shadow of his body moved across the wall with it. Then he bowed and sat down. The hall remained silent. The girl watched the shadow vanish as the sun shifted, her question still echoing but now softer, less sharp. Later that evening she approached the abbot in private. "I don't understand," she said. "What did his shadow mean?" The abbot replied, "He showed you the answer. The self, like a shadow, is there when you move, when the light strikes you, but it does not cling to you. You do not need to destroy it. Just stop chasing it." The girl felt her breath slow. Something in her softened. She bowed in gratitude, not for a spoken answer, but for the space left behind by silence. From that day on, Senzu remained wordless, but more students came to sit near him, not to hear him speak, but to witness how deeply he listened. Moral of the story: not all answers come in words. Like the monk who answered with a shadow, the deepest truths are often gestures, silences, or reflections, reminding us that we don't need to erase the self to be free. We only need to stop mistaking the shadow for what we are. The next story is called A Ladder Hanging from the Sky. High above the monastery, where clouds drifted like thoughtless prayers, a child once claimed to have seen a ladder hanging from the sky. It had no base, no visible end, just golden rungs descending into the air above the mountain ridge. Most laughed it off. "Children dream with their eyes open," the monks said kindly. But one monk, Aya, was curious not about whether the ladder was real, but why the child had seen it. That evening, Aya climbed the mountain alone. At the highest point, she sat and waited not for the ladder, but for stillness. The stars came, and the wind brushed her robe. The sky offered no miracle, only breath. Yet in that silence, something subtle happened. She looked inward and felt a presence above her. But within, each breath she took became a rung, each release a step. She realized the ladder was not something to climb. It was a reminder that what we reach for outside us is often built inside us, one moment of awareness at a time. She smiled in the dark, whispered a prayer not to the sky but to the space between thoughts. The next morning, she returned and told the child, "I saw it too." The child beamed and simply said, "I knew you would." Moral of the story: what we search for above may already live within. Like a ladder hanging from the sky, enlightenment is not always reached by climbing, but by noticing that each step begins in presence. The sky offers direction, but the journey begins where your feet already are. In a world that moves too fast and speaks too loudly, these stories are soft lanterns guiding us back to the quiet within. From clouds that forget to drift, to monks who vanish without a sound, to rivers that lose their way, yet continue to nourish each tale, reminds us that peace is not something we find. It is something we remember. Stillness lives in every pause, every shadow, every moment we stop reaching and start being. And in that silence, we rediscover the strength of softness, the beauty of letting go, and the quiet power of a path not taken. Which story whispered to your heart the most? Leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what stayed with you in the stillness. And if these stories helped you breathe a little deeper or feel a little lighter, subscribe to the channel. More calm, more presence, and more timeless wisdom awaits. Let the silence travel with you. Until next time, walk gently.